The moon is high, the fire burns low, and once again, Midnight Cat has another story to share. Come a little closer. Tonight, our journey begins not with a mighty battle or the clash of swords, but with something far quieter. A single morning in a small Viking village beside the cold northern sea. A 19-year-old fisherman named Eirik believes he is waking to another ordinary day. But before the sun can rise above the mountains, strange longships emerge from the mist, and with them arrives an offer that will change the course of his life forever. Somewhere beyond the endless western ocean lies a mysterious green island, a place spoken of only in whispers around winter fires. Most believe it is nothing more than an old tale. Yet one man carries a forgotten symbol, and another has spent years trying to bury its memory. Tonight, we'll discover why Eirik's father never spoke of that island again, why the sea seemed to call only to him, and whether some legends are waiting for the right person to find them. So, get comfortable. Let the worries of today drift away with the tide, and follow Midnight Cat into another peaceful journey through the world of the Vikings. Long before the first hint of dawn touched the peaks of the northern mountains, Eirik was already awake. For several quiet moments he remained beneath a heavy wool blanket, listening to the familiar sounds of the small timber house. The fire at the center had faded into glowing embers that breathed a faint warmth into the room. Outside, the wind slipped between the wooden walls with a low, patient whistle, carrying the distant rhythm of waves striking the rocky shore. It was a sound that had followed him since the day he was born. His father often said that no child truly belonged to the north until they learned to sleep while the sea sang outside their window. Eirik smiled faintly at the memory before sitting up. The floor was cold beneath his bare feet. He dressed slowly in a wool tunic dyed with faded brown roots, fastened a leather belt around his waist, and wrapped a thick cloak over his shoulders. Across the room, his father still slept, though only lightly. Bjorn had the habit of opening one eye whenever someone moved, a habit earned during many seasons at sea. His thick beard had begun to show threads of gray, yet his broad shoulders still carried the strength of a man who had spent his life rowing against storms. Near the hearth, Eirik's mother, Astrid, quietly stirred a pot hanging above the coals. The scent of barley porridge mixed with smoked fish filled the house. "You woke before the gulls," she whispered with a gentle smile. "I couldn't sleep. You've been thinking again." "I suppose I have." She laughed softly. "You think too much for a fisherman." Before Eirik could answer, Bjorn opened his eyes without lifting his head, and too little for a scald. The three of them shared a quiet laugh that needed no explanation. Their mornings often began this way, wrapped in ordinary conversation that had become part of the rhythm of their lives. Outside, darkness slowly surrendered to a pale blue sky. The village rested beside a narrow fjord, where steep cliffs protected the small harbor from the worst of the northern winds. Nearly 40 longhouses stood scattered across the hillside, each built from sturdy timber with roofs covered in thick turf that blended naturally into the green slopes during summer. Thin columns of smoke began rising from the rooftops one after another. The village was waking. Men prepared fishing nets that had dried overnight upon wooden frames. Women carried fresh water from the nearby spring. Children chased one another between stacks of split firewood, while old dogs watched with sleepy eyes. No one hurried. The sea decided the pace of every day. Eirik stepped outside carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. Cold air immediately filled his lungs. Above him, Countless seabirds circled the cliffs, crying as the first light spread across the calm water. The fjord reflected the sky so perfectly that the mountains seemed to rise both above and below the horizon. For a brief moment, it felt as though the world had no end. His closest friend, Leif, waved from the shoreline. "You finally decided to leave your blanket. I've been awake longer than you." "Impossible." Leif grinned as he pulled a weathered fishing net across the pebbled beach. 2 years older than Eirik, he possessed endless confidence, whether deserved or not. His laughter usually reached people before he did. Together, they inspected the net. Several sections required repair. Small tears were common after drifting near underwater rocks. Eirik knelt without speaking. His fingers moved automatically, weaving fresh cord through the damaged mesh exactly as his father had taught him years before. For a while, neither of them spoke. Only the sea did. Gentle waves rolled against the stones. Wood creaked softly as fishing boats rocked beside the dock. Somewhere farther out, a seal surfaced before disappearing again beneath the silver water. "I heard something yesterday," Leif finally said. "You usually do." This time it wasn't gossip. Eirik raised an eyebrow. "My uncle returned from the southern trading port. And he says ships from distant kingdoms have been arriving earlier than usual. That happens. He also said strangers were asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Leif lowered his voice despite nobody standing nearby. "They wanted to know whether anyone here remembered the old western route." Eirik paused. "The western route?" Leif nodded. "The one sailors stopped speaking about long before we were born." Eirik had heard the name only a handful of times, always from old storytellers after several cups of ale. Every tale ended differently. Some claimed the sea itself swallowed those who searched for it. Others insisted the route simply vanished after winters of drifting ice. His father had never spoken about it. Not once. The thought lingered as they finished repairing the net and carried it toward the waiting boat. High above the harbor, standing upon the cliffs where every returning ship could be seen, an old raven landed silently on a weathered standing stone carved with symbols so worn that almost no one in the village could still read them. The bird remained perfectly still, watching the sea, watching the village, watching Eirik. And far beyond the mouth of the fjord, where morning mist still covered the open ocean, something moved through the fog. Too distant to recognize, yet large enough that neither wave nor cloud could fully conceal its shape. The shape beyond the mist remained visible only for a heartbeat. Then it disappeared. Eirik narrowed his eyes, wondering whether he had truly seen anything at all. The morning sun had only begun to rise, painting pale ribbons of gold across the water, and the shifting fog often played the tricks upon even the most experienced sailors. "Did you see that?" he asked quietly. Leif looked toward the mouth of the fjord. "See what?" There was something. Leif searched the horizon for several moments before shrugging. Probably another merchant ship. Perhaps. Yet Eirik was not convinced. Merchant vessels usually appeared as dark silhouettes with square sails standing proudly above the mist. Whatever he had glimpsed seemed lower upon the water, almost as though it drifted instead of sailed. The thought stayed with him while they pushed their fishing boat into the calm fjord. The cold sea welcomed them with its familiar scent of salt, wet wood, and seaweed. Their small boat rocked gently beneath them as they climbed aboard. Leif settled at the oars, while Eirik adjusted the fishing lines and secured the repaired net beneath the forward bench. Without another word, they began rowing. The village slowly grew smaller behind them. Smoke continued rising from the rooftops, blending with the morning mist until the homes seemed to melt into the mountains themselves. Above the cliffs, gulls circled endlessly, their sharp cries carried across the still water. "This weather won't last," Leaf said, glancing toward the western sky. "You think a storm is coming?" "My knees say so," Eirik laughed. "Your knees are only 21 winters old. They're wiser than I am. That wouldn't be difficult." Leif answered with a playful shove of the oar that sent a splash of icy water across Eirik's boots. By mid-morning they had reached their usual fishing grounds, where the fjord opened into deeper water. Here, the current flowed more strongly, bringing shoals of cod close to the rocky seabed. Eirik lowered the net carefully. His father had always taught him that impatience frightened fish more surely than noise. "Let the sea decide," Bjorn often said. "You never conquer it. You simply ask for its kindness." Those words returned to Eirik every time he worked upon the water. The sea rewarded those who listened. It punished those who believed themselves stronger. For nearly an hour they worked in peaceful silence. The gentle splash of oars, the cree of damp timber, the distant calls of seabirds, the steady breathing of two young fishermen who had known this rhythm since childhood. Eventually, the first net came up heavy. Silver fish flashed wildly beneath the sunlight as they struggled inside the woven cords. Leif grinned. "We'll eat well tonight, and your mother will remind everyone that her son caught every single one." As she should. Together they sorted the catch into wooden baskets. Some fish would feed their families. Others would be traded for grain, wool, lamp oil, and iron nails from merchants arriving later in the season. Life in the village depended upon countless mornings just like this one. No songs would ever be written about them. Yet, without such mornings, no longship could ever leave the harbor. As the sun climbed higher, they drifted quietly while repairing another section of net. Leif broke the silence. "Have you ever wanted to leave?" Eirik looked toward the endless western horizon. "Leave? Forever?" "I don't know. My father traveled when he was young. So did mine. They both came back." Leif nodded slowly. "But sometimes I wonder what they saw." Eirik did not answer immediately. He had often wondered the same, not because he disliked home. The village was everything he knew. Every cliff held childhood memories. Every path carried familiar footprints. Even the changing winds seemed to greet him like old companions. Still, there were moments, especially on quiet mornings like this one, when the horizon seemed less like the edge of the world and more like an unanswered question. "My grandmother used to tell stories," Leif continued. "She believed every person has one journey waiting for them." "What kind of journey?" "The one that changes who they are." Eirik smiled faintly. "Perhaps mine is learning to mend fishing nets without stabbing my thumb." Leif laughed loudly enough to send another flock of gulls into the sky. The easy laughter lingered between them long after the joke had ended. It reminded Eirik how fortunate he was. Many young men dreamed only of battle and glory. He was grateful for simple things, for calm seas, for warm bread waiting at home, for evenings beside the hearth while his mother spun wool and his father carved wood with patient hands. Those ordinary moments felt permanent, as though nothing in the world could ever disturb them. Neither of them noticed the raven until its shadow crossed the boat. It circled only once before gliding toward the western cliffs. Around one of its legs hung a narrow strip of faded leather. Not a natural thing, a message, or perhaps the remnant of one. The bird vanished beyond the rocks before either young man could react. Leif stared after it. I've never seen that before. Neither have I. They looked toward the cliffs for several silent moments. Then, carried faintly across the water by the afternoon wind, came the deep, unmistakable sound of a great horn echoing from the village. Once, then again. Not the call welcoming fishermen home. Not the signal for a feast. This was the ancient warning horn that every child recognized, and almost no one had ever heard with their own ears. The sound of the horn rolled across the fjord like distant thunder. Once, then a second time. Its deep voice echoed from the cliffs, crossed the quiet water, and lingered among the mountains before fading into silence. Eirik and Leif looked at one another without speaking. Neither of them smiled. Every child in the village knew the meaning of that horn. It was never sounded for ordinary news. It called every able man back to shore immediately, no matter where he was fishing or what work remained unfinished. Leif was the first to reach for the oars. We're going home. Eirik nodded and quickly secured the baskets of fish beneath the seats. The net could wait. Whatever had happened was more important than a day's catch. The boat turned toward the village. The calm water that had seemed so peaceful only moments before now felt strangely empty. Even the gulls had grown quieter, circling high above without their usual cries. A cool wind slipped down from the mountains, carrying with it the scent of pine forests and damp stone. Neither young man spoke during the journey. Their oars rose and fell together with steady rhythm, sending ripples across the silver surface of the fjord. As they drew closer to shore, they noticed they were not alone. Fishing boats from every direction were already returning. Old Eirik's narrow boat cut through the water near the eastern cliffs. Two brothers from the upper farms rowed hard enough that spray flew from their oars. Farther out, 3 larger boats had already formed a line toward the harbor. No one called greetings. No one laughed. The village itself looked different. People gathered near the docks instead of returning to their daily work. Women stood beside the longhouses with children close to them. Dogs barked restlessly. Even the sheep grazing on the hillside seemed unsettled by the unusual movement below. By the time Eirik and Leif pulled their boat onto the pebbled beach, nearly every fisherman had arrived. What happened? Leif asked an older man tying his boat. The man shook his head. Nobody knows yet. Who sounded the horn? The watchman. Did he see raiders? I don't think so. The uncertainty was somehow worse than certainty. Eirik hurried uphill toward the center of the village, where people had begun gathering around the great ash tree that stood beside the meeting stone. The tree was older than anyone could remember. Its broad branches stretched over the square like protective arms, offering shade during summer gatherings and shelter during autumn rain. At its base stood Jarl Hakon. The old leader was taller than most men despite the weight of his years. His gray hair reached his shoulders, and a heavy wolf fur cloak rested across armor that had clearly seen many seasons. A long scar crossed his left cheek, disappearing beneath his beard. He waited patiently while the villagers assembled. When silence finally settled over the crowd, he spoke. I know many of you expected bad news. His voice was calm but carried easily. This morning, our watchman saw sails beyond the western islands. A murmur spread through the gathering. Raiders? Someone asked. Hakon slowly shook his head. No, another voice rose. Then who? We do not yet know. That answer produced even more uneasy whispers. Unknown ships were often more troubling than known enemies. If they are traders, another fisherman said, why not enter the fjord? They remained beyond the mist, replied Håkon. How many? Only one ship. The crowd fell silent again. One ship. Too few for a raid, too cautious for ordinary merchants. Eirik glanced toward his father, who had quietly joined the gathering some time after him. Bjorn's face revealed almost nothing. Almost. For the briefest moment, Eirik noticed something unusual. Recognition. It disappeared so quickly that he wondered whether he had imagined it. Håkon continued. We have posted extra watches along the cliffs. Until we learn more, everyone will remain alert. An elderly woman raised her hand. Could they be from Denmark? Perhaps. Or Norway. Perhaps. Or farther. The Jarl hesitated before answering. That is also possible. The meeting ended without certainty. Slowly, the villagers returned to their work, though conversations now filled every path between the longhouses. Children invented wild stories before noon. Some claimed kings were arriving. Others whispered about monsters hidden beneath the fog. Older men simply sharpened axes while pretending not to worry. Life continued. Yet something invisible had shifted. That evening, after the fish had been cleaned and salted, Eirik helped his father repair one of the village's larger fishing boats. The scent of fresh pine tar drifted through the cool evening air. Bjorn worked carefully, pressing heated pitch into narrow seams between the planks. His movements remained steady. Too steady. Finally, Eirik broke the silence. You recognized something today. Bjorn kept working. What makes you think that? I saw your face. You saw an old fisherman thinking. I saw more than that. His father paused for the first time, only for a heartbeat. Then he resumed spreading the tar. The sea brings many strangers, but not enough to make the warning horn sound. No. Eirik waited. His father rarely spoke before choosing every word. When I was younger, Bjorn finally said, I sailed farther west than most men in this village. I know. There are places beyond these waters that few remember. You've never spoken about them. There are reasons. What reasons? Bjorn looked toward the darkening horizon. The sea keeps its own memories. Before Eirik could ask another question, his father stood. That's enough work for today. He gathered the tools and began walking toward home. The conversation was over. Eirik remained beside the unfinished boat. The last light of evening painted the fjord with deep shades of amber and crimson. Gentle waves touched the shoreline with the same quiet rhythm they always had. Yet his father's words echoed louder than the sea itself. There are places beyond these waters that few remember. As darkness settled over the village, the watchfires were lit upon the western cliffs. Far beyond their glow, hidden beneath a blanket of drifting fog, a lone longship silently lowered its sail and dropped a stone anchor into waters no outsider had entered for more than 30 years. The village settled into night, but true silence never came. Somewhere beyond the walls of every longhouse, the sea continued its endless conversation with the shore. Gentle waves rolled across smooth stones. The tide whispered beneath the docks, and the wind wandered through the pines that crowned the cliffs above the fjord. It was a familiar music, one that had comforted generations before Eirik and would remain long after his own name was forgotten. Yet that night, even the sea seemed to be listening. Eirik lay awake beneath his blanket, staring into the darkness above him. The dying fire cast soft orange light across the timber beams, filling the room with slow-moving shadows. Beside the hearth, Astrid quietly finished mending one of Bjorn's wool cloaks before folding it neatly across a wooden chest. "You should sleep," she whispered. "I've tried." She smiled knowingly. "When your father was your age, he was exactly the same." Bjorn, who appeared to be asleep on the opposite side of the room, let out a quiet grunt. "I was much quieter." Astrid laughed. "You were many things. Quiet was never one of them." Even Eirik couldn't help smiling. For a little while, the unease that had settled over the village seemed to fade beneath the warmth of ordinary family conversation. Astrid finally extinguished the last oil lamp. Darkness filled the house. Only the embers remained. Sometime later, Eirik awoke again. At first, he wasn't sure why. The room was still. The fire had nearly gone out. Outside, the wind had changed direction. Then he heard it. The wooden door opened slowly. Not with the cautious movements of a thief, but with the confidence of someone trying not to wake another person. Eirik kept his eyes closed. Soft footsteps crossed the floor. A cloak was lifted from its peg. Leather boots scraped quietly against the threshold. Then the door closed once more. A few moments later, another sound reached him. The stable. One horse. Leaving. Eirik waited until everything became quiet again before opening his eyes. His father's bed was empty. He considered following immediately, but the darkness outside was complete, and Bjorn had vanished several minutes earlier. Chasing him blindly through the forests above the village would accomplish nothing. Instead, Eirik lay awake until dawn, listening to the sea. Morning arrived beneath low gray clouds. The air smelled different. Rain. Not heavy rain, but the kind that settled gently over the fjords for hours, covering everything in a cool mist. The village continued its work despite the weather. Women gathered herbs before the rain strengthened. Children carried bundles of firewood beneath shelter. Blacksmiths worked beside glowing forges, their rhythmic hammer blows echoing through the damp air. Eirik searched for his father. He finally found him near the small boathouse beside the western dock. Bjorn was sharpening a broad woodworking axe. "You left last night." His father did not look up. "I did." "Where?" "To think." "In the forest?" "Among old stones." Eirik frowned. "There are stones everywhere." "There are. You've never gone riding at midnight before." Bjorn finally raised his eyes. "You notice too much." "I notice because you're hiding something." For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the roof. Nearby, someone split logs for winter. Finally, Bjorn sighed. "When a man reaches my age, he carries memories that younger people should not inherit too early." "What if those memories return, whether you want them to or not?" His father rested the axe across his knees. "That is exactly what worries me." Before Eirik could ask another question, footsteps approached. It was Leif, soaked from the rain but grinning as always. "The Jarl wants everyone at the shipyard." Bjorn stood immediately. "Did something happen?" Leif nodded. "A traveler has arrived." "A trader?" "No." "A messenger?" Leif shook his head. "Nobody knows." The shipyard stood at the northern edge of the harbor where the largest vessels were built. Massive oak beams rested beneath wooden shelters. Half-finished hulls weighted upside down upon heavy supports, while craftsmen shaped planks with axes and draw knives. The smell of fresh timber mixed with pine resin and wet earth. Nearly the entire village had gathered there. Standing beside Jarl Hakon was a single traveler. He wore a dark wool cloak soaked with rain, its hood covering much of his face. His boots were badly worn, and salt stains covered the edges of his clothing, signs of many weeks at sea. Unlike most visitors, he carried no sword, only a walking staff carved with twisting knots. When the hood finally fell back, Eirik saw an older man, perhaps 60 winters, with silver hair tied behind his head and sharp gray eyes that missed very little. The stranger looked less like a warrior than a man who had spent his life watching the world. "I thank you for your welcome," he said calmly. "My name is Halvard." His voice carried the quiet confidence of an experienced storyteller. "I ask only for food, shelter, and a conversation with one man." The villagers exchanged curious glances. Jarl Hakon folded his arms. "Which man?" Halvard slowly turned his gaze across the gathered faces. It stopped on Bjorn. The old traveler smiled faintly. "It has been many years, old friend." Every conversation in the shipyard stopped. Eirik looked at his father. Bjorn had become completely still. Not surprised, not frightened. But the expression on his face belonged to someone who had just seen a ghost step out of the sea. And for the first time in Eirik's life, he realized there was an entire chapter of his father's story that no one in the village had ever been told. No one spoke. The steady patter of rain upon the shipyard roof became the only sound, as every pair of eyes moved from the gray-haired traveler to Bjorn. The silence stretched long enough for even the children to stop whispering. Finally, Jarl Hakon broke it. "You know this man?" Bjorn did not answer immediately. His broad hands remained still at his sides, though Eirik noticed the faint tightening of his fingers. "Yes," he said at last. His voice was calm but quieter than usual. "I know him." Halvard inclined his head respectfully. "It has been 31 winters." Bjorn gave the slightest nod. 31. Several of the older villagers exchanged puzzled glances. Few among them had known Bjorn for longer than 25 years. He had arrived in the village as a strong young sailor, married Astrid a few seasons later, and built the life everyone believed they understood. Yet no one had ever spoken of the years before that. Jarl Hakon studied both men carefully. "If this traveler is known to you, he will receive our hospitality." "It is deserved," Bjorn replied. "Then he shall stay." The tension eased, though only slightly. People slowly returned to their work, but their conversations had changed. Axes continued shaping timber. Blacksmiths resumed hammering iron, and fishermen repaired nets beneath the shelters. Yet nearly every glance wandered back toward the two old men. Questions spread through the village faster than the rain. Who was Halvard? Where had he come from? Why had no one ever heard his name? Eirik found himself carrying fresh firewood toward his family's house beside Leif. "You've never mentioned him," Leif whispered. "I've never heard of him." "Your father looked as though he'd seen Odin himself." Eirik managed a faint smile. "Let's hope it wasn't." By evening, the rain had passed. The clouds drifted eastward, leaving behind clear northern skies washed clean by the storm. Small pools reflected the fading sunlight, and the scent of wet pine filled the cool air. Astrid prepared a larger meal than usual. Fresh bread, roasted trout, stewed roots, goat cheese, honey gathered from the hillside hives. Guests were treated generously in their home, as tradition demanded. Halvard accepted every offering with quiet gratitude. "You still bake the same barley bread," he said after his first bite. Astrid laughed. I'll choose to take that as a compliment. You should. Bjorn almost smiled. Almost. Throughout the meal, the conversation remained ordinary. They spoke of weather, fishing, the coming autumn, trade ships expected before winter. Not once did either old man mention wherever they had first met. Eirik noticed. So did Astrid. She had lived beside Bjorn for 2 decades. She recognized the careful silence between the two men better than anyone. After supper, she quietly gathered the wooden bowls. I'll fetch more water. I'll help, Eirik offered. She looked at him for a moment. No. Her voice remained gentle. Stay. He understood. She wanted him to hear whatever came next. The door closed softly behind her. For several breaths, only the crackling fire filled the room. Then Halvard spoke. I never believed I would find you here. I hoped you wouldn't. I searched for many years. I know. You knew. Bjorn nodded. I heard stories. Halvard sighed. You always did hear more than most. Eirik sat motionless, afraid that even shifting his weight might interrupt them. His father looked into the flames before speaking again. I left because it was necessary. You disappeared. I survived. There is a difference. Neither man sounded angry, only tired. The weariness of memories carried for decades. Halvard rested both hands upon his walking staff. They're searching again. Bjorn's eyes lifted immediately. Who? The same men. Silence. They never stopped? No. They should have forgotten. They tried. Another silence. Longer this time. Eirik felt as though he had stepped into the middle of a story that had begun long before he was born. Finally, he spoke. Father. Both men turned toward him. What are you talking about? Bjorn looked at Halvard, then back at his son. I suppose you deserve something resembling an answer. He leaned back slowly. When I was younger than you are now, I sailed far beyond the routes known to most traders. West? Farther. With him? Halvard nodded. We were part of the same expedition. What were you searching for? Bjorn smiled sadly. At first, he looked toward the fire. Nothing. We simply wanted to see what lay beyond familiar waters. Then what changed? Neither old man answered immediately. The flames danced across their weathered faces. Finally, Halvard said quietly, We found something. Eirik leaned forward. What? Halvard opened his mouth. Before a single word escaped, 3 loud knocks echoed against the front door. Not hurried, not frightened. Firm, not official. Bjorn stood. When he opened the door, Jarl Hakon was waiting outside beneath the moonlight. His expression was unusually grave. We've captured one of the strangers. Bjorn's face hardened. Alive? For now. Where? In the meeting hall. Hakon looked briefly toward Halvard before continuing. He asked for only one thing. What? He refuses to speak. The Jarl's eyes settled on Bjorn. Unless you are the one asking the questions. The room fell silent. Outside, beyond the quiet rooftops of the sleeping village, waves rolled steadily into the fjord, as they always had. But somewhere beyond the western horizon, hidden by darkness instead of fog, another ship silently changed course. Not toward open sea. Toward the village. The meeting hall stood near the center of the village, built from thick pine logs darkened by countless winters. Carved dragon heads guarded the entrance, their weathered faces watching over every gathering, feast, and judgment that had taken place within those walls. Tonight, the hall felt different. The usual warmth of laughter and conversation had been replaced by a quiet tension that settled over every bench. Oil lamps flickered along the walls, casting long shadows across carved wooden pillars. At the center of the room stood Jarl Hakon beside a broad oak table. Around him waited several of the village's oldest warriors, men whose faces had been shaped by decades of storms rather than battles. Near the far end of the hall sat the stranger. His hands were tied with thick rope, though not cruelly. He wore a dark wool cloak, unlike those commonly seen in the northern villages. Salt stained its edges, and one sleeve had been torn during what appeared to have been a difficult journey through rough seas. He was younger than Eirik expected, perhaps 30 winters. His black hair reached his shoulders, and a short beard framed a face marked by exhaustion rather than fear. When Bjorn entered, the prisoner slowly lifted his head. For the first time since his capture, he spoke. "I knew you were still alive." His voice was steady. Bjorn stopped several steps away. "So you know my face." "I was told to remember it." "By whom?" The stranger hesitated. "I cannot answer that." Jarl Hakon folded his arms. "You refused to speak to every man in this village. I gave my word. You are standing in my hall?" "I know." "Then answer honestly." The prisoner lowered his eyes. "I will answer what I can." Bjorn stepped closer until only the table separated them. "What is your name?" "Sven." "Where do you come from?" "The Western Sea." "That is not an answer. It is the only one I can safely give." The old warriors exchanged uncertain glances. No sailor described his homeland so vaguely unless he wished to hide it. Bjorn remained patient. "Why were you watching our village?" "I was not watching." "You were found on the cliffs." "I was searching." "For what?" The prisoner finally met Bjorn's eyes. "For you." The room became silent once more. Eirik felt his heartbeat quicken. Everything seemed to point toward the same hidden past. Bjorn spoke again. "Who sent you?" Sven closed his eyes briefly before answering. "A man called Ragnvald." The name struck Bjorn like a sudden winter wind. Only the slightest movement crossed his face, but Eirik noticed it immediately. Halvard noticed as well. "So," the old traveler whispered, "he truly lives." Bjorn did not answer. Instead, he turned toward Halvard. "You believed he was gone?" "I hoped." "So did I." Jarl Hakon looked between the two older men. "It seems everyone in this room knows more than I do." Bjorn nodded respectfully. "And that is my failure." The Jarl's expression softened. "Then perhaps it is time to correct it." For several moments Bjorn stared into the nearest oil lamp, watching the flame sway gently. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories untouched for decades. 31 winters ago, before I settled in this village, I sailed aboard a longship called Sea Wolf. The younger villagers leaned forward. It was not a raiding ship. It carried explorers, fishermen, traders, and dreamers. We believed there were still lands beyond the routes known to most sailors. Leif glanced toward Eirik, unable to hide his excitement. Bjorn continued. Our captain believed old stories that nearly everyone else had forgotten. "What stories?" Eirik asked quietly. "Stories about islands that appeared only to those who respected the sea." A few of the older warriors smiled politely. Legends, nothing more. Yet Bjorn did not smile. "We did not sail in search of treasure. We sailed in search of knowledge." Halvard nodded. Our captain collected forgotten maps from monasteries, traders, old skalds, and wandering sailors. Most contradicted one another. Yet every one of them mentioned the same thing. Eirik leaned closer. "What?" Before either man could answer, Bjorn walked toward the great fire at the center of the hall. He reached beneath his tunic. Slowly, very slowly. He pulled a leather cord over his head. Hanging from it was a small object wrapped in worn cloth. No one spoke. Bjorn carefully unfolded the cloth. Resting in his palm lay a disc no larger than the width of his hand. It was made of an unfamiliar pale stone that seemed almost white beneath the firelight. Across its surface ran finely carved lines unlike any Norse carving Eirik had ever seen. Circles, stars, interlocking symbols. None resembled runes. The room remained utterly silent. Halvard looked at the object with quiet sadness. I never thought I would see it again. Bjorn closed his fingers around the disk. Our captain found this. He paused, on an island that no map should have contained. Outside the meeting hall, the wind suddenly strengthened. The doors rattled softly against their hinges. Far beyond the mouth of the fjord, hidden beneath the darkness of the northern sea, another longship caught the rising wind. Its sail turned east, toward the village, and aboard that ship someone else carried the same strange symbol carved into a pale stone disk. The pale stone rested in Bjorn's hand like a piece of frozen moonlight. No one reached toward it. Even the boldest warriors remained where they stood, as though some instinct warned them not to disturb an object that had crossed so many years and so many unknown seas. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls of the meeting hall before fading once more into the night. Jarl Hakon was the first to speak. I have never seen a carving like that. Neither had I, Bjorn replied. Not until the day we found it. Leif leaned closer, his curiosity overcoming caution. It doesn't look like a rune. It isn't. Do you know what it says? Bjorn slowly shook his head. No. You carried it for 31 years without knowing? I carried it because I remembered where it came from. A quiet murmur passed through the hall. Eirik studied the disk carefully. The carved circles flowed into one another with remarkable precision. Tiny lines connected stars to symbols that resembled neither animals nor letters. They looked deliberate, as though they formed part of a language designed to describe the heavens themselves. It was unlike anything crafted by the smiths or woodcarvers of the north. Halvard smiled faintly. Our captain believed it was a map. A map? Leif asked. Not of land. Then of what? The sky. Several men exchanged doubtful glances. Old sailors had long navigated by stars, but none had ever carved the heavens into pale stone. Bjorn wrapped the object once more in its cloth and returned it beneath his tunic. There will be time for questions. The words disappointed everyone in the hall, including Eirik. Later that night, the villagers slowly returned to their homes. Some believed the stranger had brought only old tales. Others suspected something far more dangerous. By morning, every family would have its own version of what had happened. That was the way of small villages. Stories traveled faster than boats. Eirik walked home beside his father beneath a sky filled with stars. The rain clouds had vanished completely, leaving the Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a pale river flowing above the mountains. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Eirik broke the silence. You promised me answers. I promised something resembling answers. That's not the same. Bjorn laughed quietly. No. You've hidden this from Mother too? I've hidden parts of it. Why? His father stopped beside the cliff overlooking the fjord. Moonlight shimmered across the calm water below. When I returned from that voyage, I believed the past had been left behind. And now? Bjorn watched the horizon. Now it appears the past has remembered my name. The following morning arrived bright and unusually warm. The strange tension that had gripped the village had not disappeared, but life could not simply stop. Fishing nets still needed repair. Firewood had to be gathered. Goats wandered where goats always wandered, entirely unconcerned with ancient mysteries. Astrid sent Eirik to help old Torsten repair a damaged fence above the eastern pasture. Torsten was among the oldest men in the settlement. His beard reached nearly to his belt, and one eye had long ago turned cloudy after an accident while splitting oak. He worked slowly. He also talked constantly. "You've been spending too much time listening to old sailors," he said, while driving a wooden stake into the ground. "I've only been listening." Listening is how trouble begins. Eirik smiled. "Did trouble begin that way for you?" "Oh, certainly." Torsten rested both hands upon the top of his hammer. "When I was 17, I listened to a trader who promised that amber washed onto every beach beyond the southern sea." "And did it?" "No." "What did you find?" "A wife." Eirik laughed. "I was hoping for a better story." "So was I." The old man grinned. "But after 50 winters together, I decided it was the finest treasure I never meant to search for." They continued working beneath the warm afternoon sun. The valley below looked peaceful. Children gathered berries near the stream. Women spread wool blankets across smooth rocks to dry. A pair of fishermen repaired an overturned boat along the shoreline. Nothing suggested danger. Yet every few minutes Eirik found himself looking west, toward the open sea, toward questions that seemed to grow larger with every passing hour. That evening, the village prepared for the weekly shared meal. Long wooden tables were carried into the open square beneath the great ash tree. Fresh bread filled woven baskets. Large iron pots simmered over open fires. Roasted lamb, smoked fish, onions, herbs, wild mushrooms, and thick barley stew filled the air with comforting scents. Children chased one another between the benches until their mothers finally caught them. Musicians tuned simple bone flutes and small lyres. An elderly skald named Asger settled near one of the fires with his carved harp resting across his knees. Life, despite its uncertainties, insisted on continuing. As twilight deepened, Asger began to sing. Not of kings, not of battles, but of sailors who followed stars across quiet seas, believing that every horizon concealed another sunrise. His voice was old and weathered, yet warm enough that even the youngest children fell silent to listen. Eirik noticed Halvard standing apart from the celebration. The old traveler watched the stars instead of the musicians, almost as though he were counting them. Then, very quietly, Halvard whispered words meant for no one else. "They're early." Eirik turned. "What did you say?" Before Halvard could answer, a bright light appeared low above the western horizon. Not lightning, not the moon, not the flame of a ship. It glowed for only a few heartbeats before fading into the darkness, leaving the sea as calm as it had been moments before. Around the square, conversations slowly stopped. Every eye turned toward the west. No one could explain what they had just seen. And far beyond the sight of the villagers, hidden beyond the curve of the sea, 3 longships now sailed together in complete silence, their oars moving as one beneath the cold northern stars. The strange light vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. For several moments, no one in the village moved. Even the musicians lowered their instruments, and the cheerful murmur that had filled the square disappeared beneath an uneasy silence. The only sound came from the firewood, crackling beneath the cooking pots, and the steady whisper of the evening breeze moving through the leaves of the great ash tree. "What was that?" a young boy asked. No one answered. Old Asger slowly rested his harp across his lap. "I have lived through 68 winters," he said, "and I have learned that not every light above the sea deserves a story." One of the fishermen chuckled nervously. "You mean you've seen it before?" The old skald smiled without looking away from the western horizon. "I mean that the sea enjoys keeping a few secrets." His words offered little comfort. Gradually, conversation returned, though more quietly than before. People spoke in lowered voices, inventing explanations they hoped were true. Perhaps sunlight had reflected from distant ice. Perhaps it had been a burning star. Perhaps a merchant ship carried an unusually bright signal fire. Each explanation sounded reasonable. None felt convincing. Later that night, Eirik climbed the familiar path above the village. Whenever his thoughts became too heavy, he came to the same place, a broad stone overlooking the fjord, where the cliffs met the sea. From there, he could see nearly every roof in the settlement, the narrow docks stretching into the water, and the dark outline of the mountains beyond. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and salt. Below, small lights glowed warmly through the windows of the longhouses. Home. Simple. Peaceful. He wondered how many people in the village truly wished for anything more. Footsteps sounded behind him. "You always come here." Eirik turned. Life carried 2 wooden cups. "I thought you might prefer warm cider to sitting alone." "I wasn't sitting alone." Leif looked around theatrically. "I apologize. I didn't notice your invisible companions." Eirik laughed and accepted one of the cups. For a while they watched the sea without speaking. The moon had risen higher now, laying a silver path across the water that stretched toward the western horizon. "My father wants me to marry before winter," Leif finally admitted. Eirik nearly choked on his drink. "That's why you've looked miserable all week?" "I'm not miserable. You've complained every day. That's different. So, who is she?" "I don't know." Eirik stared. "You don't know?" "He says I'll meet her during the autumn gathering." Eirik burst into laughter. Leif shook his head dramatically. "Some friend you are." "I thought you feared raiders." "I do." "I thought you feared storms." "I definitely do." "And yet marriage frightens you more." Leif sighed. "At least storms eventually pass." Their laughter echoed softly across the quiet hillside before disappearing into the night. When it faded, Leif became thoughtful again. "Do you ever feel as though everyone expects your life to follow a path chosen long ago?" Eirik looked toward the village. "Sometimes. My father inherited his boat from my grandfather. So did mine. My sons will probably inherit it from me, if you survive meeting your future wife." Leif smiled faintly. Then his expression grew serious. "I've always believed there must be more beyond these mountains." Eirik did not answer immediately. He understood the feeling too well. "I don't want to leave forever," Leif continued. "I only want to know." "What?" "What lies beyond the places everyone already knows." The wind carried the scent of the sea between them. Eirik found himself remembering Halvard's words. "We found something." Whatever that something had been, it had changed his father forever. The following morning, Bjorn rose before anyone else. Instead of walking toward the docks, he entered the small storage shed behind their house. Eirik, already awake, quietly followed a few moments later. The shed smelled of dry timber, rope, and old leather. Sunlight slipped through narrow gaps between the wooden planks. Bjorn stood beside an old sea chest reinforced with iron bands. Eirik had seen it countless times growing up. He had never seen it opened. His father lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay carefully folded cloaks, worn tools, several sealed leather pouches. And beneath them all rested a long bundle wrapped in thick oilcloth. Bjorn unfolded it with remarkable care. A sword emerged. Its blade was unlike any weapon Eirik had seen in the village. Not because it glittered with jewels, quite the opposite. It was simple, elegant, perfectly balanced. The steel carried faint rippling patterns that flowed from guard to tip like gentle waves across calm water. The leather grip had darkened with age, shaped by years of use. "You've hidden this all my life," Bjorn nodded. "I hoped I would never need it again." "Were you a warrior?" His father considered the question. "I became one when there was no other choice." He handed the sword to Eirik. Carefully. The weapon felt lighter than expected, perfectly alive in his hands. "It isn't yours," Bjorn said quietly. "Not yet." Eirik looked up. "What do you mean?" Before Bjorn could answer, hurried footsteps approached from outside. Astrid appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "There's a ship." Both men turned immediately. "Where?" "At the mouth of the fjord." "How many?" "Only one." Bjorn took the sword back, wrapped it once more, and closed the chest without another word. Outside, the village was already stirring. Men hurried toward the cliffs. Women gathered children close beside them. The warning watchman pointed toward the western sea. Far beyond the harbor, where morning mist drifted above the calm water, a single longship had lowered its sail. It remained motionless, not advancing, not retreating, simply waiting, as though whoever stood aboard already knew that someone from the village would soon come to meet them. The longship remained motionless upon the quiet sea. Its dark hull rose and fell gently with the morning swell, neither approaching the fjord nor turning away from it. A thin veil of mist drifted around the vessel, sometimes revealing the carved prow, sometimes hiding it completely. From the cliffs above the village, dozens of eyes watched in silence. "No banners," one fisherman observed. "No trading colors either," another replied. Jarl Hakon stood with his hands resting on the pommel of his sword. "They're waiting." Bjorn said nothing. His gaze never left the ship. Eirik noticed that his father was not studying the vessel itself, but the men aboard it. Even at such a distance, he seemed to be searching for a familiar face. "They know we're here," Halvard said quietly. "They've known since sunrise." A cold breeze swept in from the west, carrying the sharp scent of salt and seaweed. The waves remained calm, but the wind had begun to shift, blowing steadily into the fjord. "The sea is inviting them in," Leif murmured, "or warning them away," Bjorn answered. After several minutes, Jarl Hakon made his decision. "We will not allow strangers to enter our harbor unchallenged." He turned toward the gathered villagers. "I need 6 men." Before anyone else could speak, Eirik stepped forward. "I'll go." His father's eyes immediately met his. "No. I can row." "I know you can. I can fight if I must." Bjorn shook his head. "You've never fought men." Eirik opened his mouth to argue, but Jarl Hakon raised a hand. "Your father is right." Disappointment settled heavily in Eirik's chest. Leif stepped beside him. "I'll stay too." The words surprised everyone. "You," Eirik whispered. Leif shrugged. "If you aren't going, someone has to stop you from stealing another boat." Even Bjorn allowed himself the smallest smile. In the end, Hakon chose Bjorn, Halvard, 3 experienced warriors, and himself. Their boat was larger than the fishing vessels, built to cross rough water while remaining fast enough to outrun unexpected danger. The 6 men climbed aboard. Without another word, they pushed away from shore. The villagers remained on the cliffs until the boat became a dark shape against the shining water. Eirik stood with Astrid. She folded her arms tightly beneath her wool shawl. "He'll come back," Eirik said. "I know. You don't sound certain." She smiled sadly. "I've watched your father sail away many times." "You never worry?" "I always worry." She looked toward the horizon. "The trick is learning to live beside worry instead of letting it live inside you." Those words stayed with Eirik as the small boat continued toward the waiting longship. Nearly an hour passed. The distance was too great for anyone on shore to hear voices, yet they could see the 2 vessels drawing alongside one another. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then a rope ladder was lowered from the stranger's ship. Only Bjorn climbed aboard. The others remained below. Eirik frowned. Why only him? "No idea," Leif answered. Together they watched the tiny figures moving across the distant deck. The meeting lasted far longer than anyone expected. Clouds drifted slowly across the sun. The tide began to change. Still, Bjorn did not return. Far out upon the western sea, Bjorn stepped onto the unfamiliar deck. The ship was well maintained but strangely plain. No carved trophies decorated its rails. No bright shields hung from its sides. Even the crew stood quietly, disciplined in a way that reminded him less of raiders and more of seasoned explorers. At the center of the deck waited an older man dressed in a dark blue cloak. His hair had turned almost completely white, though his back remained straight. When he saw Bjorn, he dismissed the rest of the crew with a single gesture. They obeyed without hesitation. For several breaths, neither man spoke. Finally, the stranger smiled. "You've grown older." Bjorn's expression remained unreadable. "So have you. I wasn't sure you'd recognize me." "I recognized the way your ship rides the waves." The old man laughed softly. "You always noticed the sea before the men." Bjorn studied him carefully. "I heard you were dead." "So did I." "What name do you use now?" "The same one." The smile faded. "Ragnvald." The name hung between them like a forgotten oath. Bjorn's jaw tightened. "You should never have come here." "I had no choice." "You always have a choice." "Not this time." The wind strengthened, tugging gently at their cloaks. Ragnvald walked toward the ship's railing and looked back toward the distant village. "It seems peaceful." "It is." "You built a good life." "I tried. And now that peace is ending." Bjorn's eyes narrowed. "What happened?" Ragnvald reached beneath his cloak. For one terrible moment, Bjorn's hand moved toward the knife at his belt. Instead of a weapon, Ragnvald withdrew a tightly rolled piece of weathered leather. An old map. Its edges were cracked by age. Salt had faded much of the ink. Yet one symbol remained perfectly clear. The same strange circle carved into Bjorn's pale stone. Ragnvald carefully unrolled the map across a wooden crate. There wasn't supposed to be another expedition. There won't be. There already is. Bjorn felt the blood drain from his face. Who sent them? I don't know. But I know where they're sailing. He placed one finger upon the faded symbol. They're going back. Bjorn stared at the ancient map without moving. The island he had spent 31 years trying to forget had just become the destination of someone else. For several moments, Bjorn could not take his eyes off the map. The leather had grown stiff with age, its edges cracked by countless journeys across salt water and changing climates. Thin lines, drawn with remarkable precision, crossed the faded surface like the branches of an ancient tree. Most of the markings meant nothing to anyone unfamiliar with the western seas. Yet Bjorn remembered them, not because he had studied the map, because he had once sailed it. Very slowly, he reached out and rested his fingertips on one of the weathered lines. I thought this had been destroyed. So did I, Ragnvald replied. It should have been. It nearly was. The older man rolled the map closed before the wind could catch it. I found it 3 summers ago. Where? In the ruins of an old monastery on the northern coast. Bjorn frowned. A monastery? The monks had hidden it beneath the floor of their library. How did they obtain it? I never learned. Bjorn looked toward the western horizon. The sea stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun, calm enough to deceive anyone who believed it, harmless. You should have burned it. I considered it. And yet you didn't. Ragnvald gave a weary smile. I knew that one day I might need to show it to the only man still alive who could understand what it meant. You overestimate my memory. No. I remember enough. The words carried more weight than Bjorn intended. Memories returned more easily than he wished. The creaking of a younger ship. The eager voices of friends long buried. The thrill of sailing where no familiar landmark guided them. And the terrible silence that had followed. Back in the village, life struggled to continue while everyone waited. The fishing boats remained tied to the docks. No one wished to sail while their jarl and several experienced men were absent. Children, sensing the unusual mood, played more quietly than usual. Even the village dogs wandered the streets with uncertain curiosity. Eirik found himself unable to remain still. He carried fresh water, split firewood, helped repair a damaged cartwheel. None of it settled his thoughts. At last, Astrid placed a gentle hand upon his shoulder. "Walk with me." Together they climbed a narrow path leading toward the western fields where sheep grazed among patches of wildflowers. The wind bent the tall grass into slow, rolling waves. "You've inherited your father's patience," she said. Eirik laughed. "I don't feel patient." "No, but you try to be." They continued walking. After a while, Astrid stopped beside a large boulder covered with pale green moss. "Your father wasn't always so quiet." Eirik looked at her with surprise. "No?" He laughed more. "What changed?" She watched the distant sea before answering. He returned from one voyage carrying fewer companions than he had left with. Eirik remained silent. He rarely spoke about them. "Did you ask?" "Many times." "And?" He always answered kindly, but never completely. A cool breeze carried the scent of the ocean across the hillside. Astrid smiled softly. "I learned something important." "What?" "Everyone has a room inside their heart." Eirik listened. "Some rooms remain open. Others stay locked. You cannot force the door. You simply wait until the person inside is ready to invite you." The words settled gently within him. He realized she was speaking not only about Bjorn. She was speaking about everyone, even him. Far out upon the stranger's ship, Bjorn and Ragnvald stood alone near the stern. "You said another expedition is already sailing." "Yes." "How far behind are they?" "Perhaps 2 weeks." Bjorn's eyes narrowed. "They'll never reach it." "I once believed that." "What changed?" Ragnvald walked toward the railing. "The sea changed." Bjorn looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" "The currents, the ice, the stars." He spoke quietly, almost reluctantly. The roots are no longer the same as they were 30 years ago. Bjorn felt a familiar unease. Every experienced sailor knew that coastlines remained constant while the sea itself never did. Currents shifted, sandbars appeared, storms carved new passages. But Ragnvald spoke as though something far greater had changed. "I've spent 12 summers studying the western waters," he continued. "The old paths no longer lead where they once did." Bjorn frowned. "That isn't possible. I've watched it happen. Winds change. So do tides. But not like this." Ragnvald reached into a small wooden chest beside the mast. From it he removed several smooth stones. Each bore the same strange carved symbol. There used to be one. He placed the stones in a neat row. Now there are 6. Bjorn stared. "Where did you find them?" "Different islands." "Impossible." "I wish it were." For the first time since boarding the ship, genuine uncertainty appeared in Bjorn's eyes. If these symbols had begun appearing elsewhere, then whatever they had discovered 3 decades earlier had never truly remained hidden. Back in the village, the waiting finally ended. A young watchman standing atop the western cliffs suddenly shouted, "They're returning." People hurried toward the shoreline. Eirik reached the docks just as the small boat entered the harbor. The 6 men looked exhausted. None smiled. Bjorn stepped onto the shore carrying something wrapped carefully beneath his cloak. Jarl Håkon immediately turned toward the gathered villagers. "Everyone return to your homes. No explanation, no celebration, only quiet authority." The people obeyed. As Eirik walked beside his father toward home, he noticed something that sent a chill through him. Bjorn's hands. They were steady. His father's hands had always been steady, but now they trembled ever so slightly. Not from age, not from cold, from fear. And Eirik had never seen his father afraid of anything before. Bjorn spoke very little on the walk home. The narrow path wound between low stone walls and patches of heather swaying gently beneath the afternoon breeze. The village carried on around them, though more quietly than usual. Women drew water from the spring. Children gathered driftwood along the shore, and fishermen inspected boats that had never left the harbor that morning. Life refused to surrender to uncertainty. Yet every face Eirik passed held the same question. What had happened beyond the mouth of the fjord? When they reached their home, Astrid was already waiting outside. She searched Bjorn's face before saying a single word. "You've seen him." "I have." "And?" Bjorn looked toward the sea instead of answering. "The past has crossed our doorstep." Astrid closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though those were the exact words she had feared. Without another question, she ushered them inside. The familiar warmth of the house wrapped around them. A pot of lamb stew simmered above the fire. Fresh rye bread cooled upon a wooden board beside a bowl of churned butter, and bunches of drying herbs hung from the rafters, filling the room with the comforting scents of thyme and juniper. For the first time that day, Eirik realized how hungry he was. Astrid placed 3 bowls on the table. "Eat first." Bjorn nodded. "Your mother is wiser than any jarl." "She usually is." A faint smile crossed Astrid's face. "You're trying to delay this conversation." "I am. It won't help." "No." Even so, they ate before speaking further. The ordinary ritual slowed their racing thoughts. The warmth of the meal, the crackling fire, and the familiar silence between family members reminded Eirik that not every battle was fought with swords. Some required patience. When the bowls had been cleared away, Bjorn rose from the bench. From beneath his cloak, he withdrew the bundle he had carried home. Carefully, he unwrapped it. Not the pale stone, not the sword. The old map. Its weathered leather spread across the table between them. Astrid stared at it without touching it. So, it still exists. Bjorn looked up. You've seen this before? Only once. When? The night before you left it behind. Eirik blinked. You knew about it? A little. She smiled sadly. Your father believed he was protecting me. Bjorn lowered his head. I was. No. Astrid replied gently. You were protecting yourself. Silence settled over the room. The words were spoken without anger, only understanding. Bjorn traced one finger across the faded markings. When I was 19, Eirik looked up. The same age I am. Bjorn nodded. I believed the world could be understood simply by sailing farther than anyone else. He smiled faintly at the memory. I thought courage alone could solve every mystery. Were you afraid? Not enough. The answer surprised Eirik. Most young men fear storms. I feared storms. Bjorn's eyes remained on the map. I simply believed they happened to other people. He drew a slow breath. Our captain gathered 24 men. Some were fishermen, some traders. A few had fought in wars, but none of us were chasing glory. What were you chasing? Eirik asked. The edge of what we knew. The fire popped softly behind them. For 6 weeks, everything went as expected. Fair winds, good fishing, small islands, friendly traders. He paused. Then we found something that wasn't supposed to exist. Eirik leaned forward. The island. Bjorn looked at him. No, the sea. That evening, after Bjorn had finally fallen silent, Eirik stepped outside to clear his thoughts. The sky had turned deep blue, and the first stars appeared above the mountains. He wandered toward the docks. Several fishermen still worked beneath the torchlight, coating hulls with fresh pine tar before autumn storms arrived. Old Torsten sat upon an overturned barrel, sharpening a carving knife. You look troubled, the old man observed. I've been told half a story. Torsten chuckled. Those are the most dangerous kind. You know anything about my father's voyage? I know only what he allowed people to know, which isn't much. No. The old man tested the edge of his knife against his thumb. When Bjorn arrived here, he owned almost nothing. Only a boat, a sword, and eyes that belonged to a man much older than he was. Eirik listened carefully. I've watched many sailors return from long voyages. Torsten continued. Most bring gifts. Some bring gold. A few bring scars. What did my father bring? The old man looked toward the dark water. Silence. Far beyond the village, Ragnvald's longship had once again turned west. Its sail caught the evening wind as the coastline slowly disappeared behind the horizon. Near the stern, Halvard stood beside Ragnvald. You didn't tell him everything? No. He deserves the truth. He deserves time. Halvard folded his arms. We may not have time. Ragnvald looked toward the western sky where the first stars were beginning to emerge. I know. He reached inside his cloak and removed a second map. Unlike the first, this one was newer. Fresh ink marked a route leading across the northern ocean. Near its center, someone had drawn a small black circle. Beside it were 4 words written in careful hand. The gate opens again. Ragnvald rolled the map shut before anyone else on the ship could see it. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, They're closer than we feared. Sleep came slowly to Eirik that night. He lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of home. The wind brushing against the turf roof, the steady breathing of his parents, and the quiet murmur of the sea beyond the village. Usually, those sounds calmed him. Tonight, they only reminded him how many questions remained unanswered. His father had finally begun telling the story, but every answer uncovered two new mysteries. The sea, not the island. What could that possibly mean? Morning arrived beneath a blanket of low clouds drifting in from the northwest. A light drizzle settled over the fjord, soft enough that no one bothered to stay indoors. Rain was as ordinary as breathing in this part of the world. Bjorn was already outside when Eirik stepped into the cool morning air. He stood beside their fishing boat, running his hand slowly along the weathered planks. "You've checked her twice already," Eirik said. Bjorn smiled faintly. "I've probably checked her 10 times. Expecting damage? No. What then?" His father looked over the quiet harbor. "I'm reminding myself that some things haven't changed." The fishing boat had belonged to Bjorn for nearly 20 years. Its wood carried hundreds of small scratches from hidden rocks and rough landings. Every repair told a story. Every replacement plank had been shaped by his own hands. To anyone else, it was an ordinary vessel. To Bjorn, it was proof that a peaceful life could be built one careful season at a time. Eirik stepped beside him. "Will you tell me more today?" "I will." "No riddles?" Bjorn chuckled. "I'll try." Before they could continue, Jarl Hakon approached along the shoreline. His heavy cloak shifted in the wind, and two of the village's older warriors followed several steps behind. "Walk with me," Hakon said. Bjorn nodded. The three older men headed toward the cliffs overlooking the western sea. Eirik watched them disappear beyond the headland. Leif appeared moments later carrying a bundle of freshly cut willow branches. "They've been meeting a lot." "They have." "That's never a good sign." "No." Leif dropped the bundle onto the dock. "My father says the Jarl has ordered every longship inspected." Eirik looked up. "Everyone?" Leif nodded. "They're repairing sails that haven't been unfolded in years. That was unusual. Fishing boats needed constant maintenance. Warships were prepared only when danger seemed possible." "Do they think raiders are coming?" I asked. "And?" "My father said if raiders were coming, everyone would be happier." By midday, the rain had stopped. The village echoed with the sounds of work. Blacksmiths sharpened spearheads. Carpenters replaced cracked oars. Women stitched fresh wool sails where old seams had weakened. Children carried buckets of pitch to the shipyard, delighted to be trusted with important work, even if most of it ended up on their boots. The preparations spread through the settlement without panic. Everyone worked. Few asked questions. That was the northern way. Late in the afternoon, Bjorn returned. "Eirik." "Yes?" "Bring your cloak." "Where are we going?" "To the old watch hill." It overlooked both the fjord and the open sea, though few people climbed there anymore. The path was steep, winding through clusters of birch and twisted pine before emerging onto a broad ridge, where ancient standing stones overlooked the coast. The air felt cooler there, sharper. The sea stretched endlessly before them. Bjorn remained silent until they reached the tallest stone. Its carved runes had almost disappeared beneath centuries of rain. "My father brought me here," Bjorn said quietly. "The day before my first voyage." Eirik rested his hand against the cold stone. "What did he tell you?" "He said that every sailor believes he chooses his course." Bjorn looked toward the horizon. "But the sea chooses which kind of man returns." The words lingered between them. I didn't understand him then. And now I do. They stood together for several minutes, watching white-backed waves roll steadily toward the cliffs below. You asked what changed on our expedition. I did. Bjorn drew a slow breath. During the 7th week, we entered waters unlike any we had ever sailed. In what way? There was no storm, no fog, no ice. Everything looked normal. Eirik frowned. Then what was different? The sea stopped behaving like the sea. He knelt and picked up a small stone. Throwing it toward the cliff's edge, they both watched it tumble into the water below. It always falls. Of course. So do currents. So do tides. They follow patterns. Bjorn looked directly at his son. Out there, he pointed west. Those patterns vanished. You mean the current changed? No. It disappeared. Eirik stared at him. For 3 days, our ship drifted across water that seemed almost asleep. No waves, small ones, no wind, enough to fill the sail. Then what? Bjorn searched for the right words. Our navigator measured the stars every night. He insisted we were sailing west. Our helmsman swore we were turning north. The sun told another story entirely. Nothing agreed. Eirik felt a chill despite the mild afternoon. Was someone wrong? We thought so. Were they? Bjorn slowly shook his head. No. He turned back toward the sea. That was the first moment we realized. He hesitated, that the old legends weren't warning sailors about a place. They were warning them about a journey. Before Eirik could ask another question, a raven landed atop the ancient standing stone. Its black feathers shimmered in the fading light. Tied to one leg was a narrow strip of fresh leather. Not old, not weathered. Fresh. The bird remained perfectly still, watching Bjorn as though it had been sent with a purpose. Then, without a sound, it spread its wings and flew west, toward the endless sea. Bjorn's face grew pale. I know that messenger. Eirik looked at him in disbelief. You've seen it before? His father never took his eyes off the shrinking bird. Yes. The last time. His voice dropped to little more than a whisper. Was the day before our expedition disappeared. The raven became a black speck against the western sky before finally disappearing beyond the cliffs. Neither Bjorn nor Eirik moved. The wind flowed around the standing stones with a low, mournful voice, stirring the heather at their feet. Far below, waves burst against the rocks in slow, steady rhythms that had echoed there for centuries. At last, Eirik spoke. You truly recognize that bird? Bjorn remained silent for several moments. I recognize the message. You couldn't read it. I didn't need to. His father rested one hand upon the weathered standing stone. Before our voyage, Captain Arne kept ravens. For messages, Bjorn nodded. They could return to ships far beyond the sight of land. I've heard of that. So had we. He smiled faintly. But Arne used them differently. How? If one bird returned with plain leather tied to its leg, it meant the fleet should continue. And if it carried marked leather, it meant danger. Eirik looked toward the west. This one carried plain leather. Yes. Then why are you worried? Bjorn's expression darkened. Because only one other man ever copied Arne's way of sending messages. Ragnvald. Yes. The realization settled heavily between them. If the raven had come from Ragnvald, then someone far beyond the village already knew exactly where Bjorn was. They remained upon the hill until sunset. Clouds drifted slowly across the northern sky, turning crimson before fading into deep shades of violet. The sea reflected every changing color until water and sky became almost impossible to distinguish. Bjorn finally began walking home. Halfway down the path, he stopped. Eirik, yes. When I tell you these things, he searched for the right words. I do not tell them to awaken your curiosity. I know. I tell them because you deserve the truth. I want the truth. Bjorn gave a tired smile. Be careful what you wish for. That evening, Jarl Hakon called another gathering. Not every villager attended. Only the heads of households, experienced sailors, craftsmen responsible for repairing ships, and the oldest warriors assembled inside the meeting hall. Eirik remained outside with Leif. They sat upon an overturned fishing boat beneath the fading light. I hate waiting, Leif muttered. You've said that 3 times. I'll probably say it 3 more. You probably will. For a while they watched smoke rise from the roofs of the longhouses. Children played one last game before being called home. Somewhere nearby, someone split firewood with calm, measured blows. Ordinary sounds. Comforting sounds. Leif picked up a smooth pebble and skipped it across the water. Do you think your father ever wanted this life? Eirik frowned. What do you mean? The quiet one. He gestured toward the village. Fishing. Repairing boats. Watching children grow up. Eirik thought carefully before answering. I think he chose it. That's not the same. No. Leif looked toward the meeting hall. My uncle fought in 3 raids. He always says peace becomes valuable only after you've seen enough war. Eirik smiled faintly. My father never speaks like a warrior. Exactly. The words lingered in Eirik's mind. His father carried himself like someone who had once fought because he had no choice, not because he had enjoyed it. Inside the hall, the discussion stretched long into the evening. When it finally ended, Jarl Hakon stepped outside. The older men followed behind him with unusually serious expressions. Bjorn approached Eirik. Walk home with your mother. And you? I have one last place to visit. Astrid looked at him knowingly. The shrine? Bjorn nodded. I won't be long. Without another word, he disappeared into the gathering darkness. The old shrine stood deep within the pine forest above the village. Few people visited it except during seasonal festivals. There was no temple, only a circle of ancient standing stones surrounding a broad oak whose branches seemed almost as old as the mountains themselves. Tiny offerings rested among its roots. Carved animals, coins, pieces of antler, small wooden boats left by sailors asking for safe voyages. Bjorn entered the circle alone. For a long while he simply stood beneath the great tree. Then he reached beneath his tunic and removed the pale stone once more. Moonlight touched its carved surface. The strange symbols seemed sharper than before, almost alive. He knelt beside the roots. I kept my promise, he whispered. I never returned. The forest remained silent. Only the wind answered. I buried the maps. I hid the truth. I built another life. His voice grew quieter. But if they're coming again, he closed his hand around the stone. I don't know how much longer I can protect him. A twig snapped somewhere beyond the trees. Bjorn stood immediately. His hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt. The forest fell silent once more. Slowly, he scanned the darkness between the trunks. Nothing. No movement, no footsteps. After another minute, he lowered his hand. Unknown to him, someone had indeed been watching. Far beyond the circle of standing stones, hidden among the pines where moonlight barely reached the forest floor, a cloaked figure remained perfectly still until Bjorn disappeared down the path. Only then did the stranger step forward. He knelt beside the roots of the old oak. His fingers touched the damp earth where Bjorn had been standing. Then, in a language unknown to the north, he quietly spoke a single sentence. The wind carried the words away before anyone else could hear them. And somewhere far beyond the western sea, a bell rang inside forgotten ruins that had remained silent for generations. Dawn arrived wrapped in silver fog. It drifted quietly into the fjord during the last hours of the night, softening every outline until the village seemed suspended between earth and sky. The cliffs became pale shadows, the docks disappeared beneath a veil of white, and even the nearest fishing boats looked like ghosts resting upon still water. Eirik stepped outside with a wooden bucket in his hand and stopped. The world had vanished. He could hear it, the gentle lapping of water against the piers, the distant call of a gull somewhere beyond the mist, the rhythmic tapping of a carpenter's hammer. Yet almost nothing could be seen. His mother joined him carrying a basket of bread. "A thick one," she said quietly. "I've never seen the fog reach this far into the village. It used to." "When?" "When I was a little girl." Astrid smiled as though remembering another lifetime. "My grandfather always said the sea sometimes hides itself because it wishes to listen." Eirik glanced toward the invisible harbor. Listen to what? The people living beside it. Despite the fog, work continued. Fishermen untangled nets by touch more than sight. Women spread fresh fish with coarse salt inside covered sheds. The blacksmith's forge glowed like a lonely star in the whiteness, its steady ringing helping people judge distance when their eyes could not. Life adapted. It always had. Eirik found Leif near the boathouses, sitting upside down inside a half-finished hull while sharpening a draw knife. "I've decided," Leif announced. "About what?" "If mysterious strangers continue arriving, I expect someone else can repair fishing nets." Eirik laughed. "So you'll become a warrior?" "No." "A trader?" "No." "A skald?" Leif looked horrified. "I'd rather wrestle a bear." "Then what?" Leif shrugged. "I don't know." He ran the blade gently across a whetstone. "I just know that I've spent my whole life believing every tomorrow would look exactly like yesterday. And now? Now I hope it doesn't." His words lingered in the cool morning air. Eirik realized he felt the same. Only days earlier, he had imagined the rest of his life unfolding beside these familiar waters. Fish, repair boats, raise a family, grow old. There had been comfort in that certainty. Now certainty itself had become unfamiliar. Near midday, Jarl Hakon summoned Bjorn, Halvard, and several respected craftsmen to the shipyard. The largest longship in the village rested beneath its timber shelter. She had not sailed in almost 5 years. Her broad hull bore the scars of countless voyages, while fresh pine tar glistened where younger shipwrights had begun sealing old seams. Hakon rested one hand upon the weathered railing. "She'll float." "She always did," Bjorn replied. "Can she survive the western sea?" Bjorn walked slowly around the vessel. He pressed his thumb into the oak planks, inspected the mast, examined every iron rivet along the keel. Finally, he looked toward the Jarl. "With enough work." "How much?" "A week." Hakon frowned. "We may not have a week." Silence followed. Halvard stepped closer. "If another expedition truly sails toward the western waters, every day matters." "I know," Hakon answered. "But I will not send my people to sea aboard a ship that cannot bring them home." Bjorn nodded in agreement. For the next several hours, the shipyard came alive. Axes rang against fresh timber. Pitch simmered over open fires. Sailmakers stitched heavy linen with thick bone needles. Ropes were stretched, tested, and replaced where age had weakened the fibers. Eirik threw himself into the work without being asked. He hauled buckets of tar, carried replacement planks, and helped twist new cordage from flax and horsehair. No one spoke of an expedition, yet everyone worked as though preparing for one. As evening approached, the fog finally lifted. The western sea emerged once more beneath clear skies washed clean by the afternoon wind. Eirik climbed the watchtower overlooking the harbor. The old lookout, Sten, stood there wrapped in a sealskin cloak. "You've been staring west all day," the old watchman said. "So have you." Steen smiled. "That's my job." He handed Eirik a polished piece of whalebone. "Look through it." Eirik raised the simple viewing tube to one eye. Far away, the horizon sharpened. He could make out distant rocks that were invisible to the naked eye. A flock of seabirds skimmed the waves. Then, something else. "There. What do you see?" Sten asked. "I'm not sure. Keep watching." The shape appeared only briefly before slipping behind a rolling swell. A sail. No, 2 sails. Eirik lowered the tube. "There are ships." Sten quietly took the bone tube back. "I counted them an hour ago." "How many?" 3. "The same ones?" "I don't think so." Eirik felt his pulse quicken. "They're coming here?" The old watchman remained silent. Instead, he studied the movement of the birds circling above the distant vessels. After a long pause, he said something that puzzled Eirik. "No. They're following something." "What?" Sten slowly lowered the viewing tube. "I've watched seabirds my entire life. They never fly like that unless another ship has already passed." Eirik looked toward the empty western horizon again. "You mean—" The old watchman nodded. "If those 3 ships are following someone." His weathered face grew unusually serious. Then someone else reached these waters before them. The evening sun dipped lower, setting the sea ablaze with gold and crimson. For a fleeting moment, one final silhouette appeared beyond the distant sails. A single vessel, smaller than the others, faster, heading west, as if racing against time itself. The last rays of sunlight lingered upon the western sea long after the mysterious silhouette had vanished. Eirik remained beside the watchtower until darkness settled over the fjord. He searched the horizon again and again, hoping the small vessel would reappear, but only the endless rhythm of the waves greeted him. At last, Sten rested a weathered hand upon his shoulder. "Come. We can't just leave. We're not leaving." The old watchman smiled faintly. "We're changing where we watch from." Together, they climbed down from the wooden platform. Below, several torches had already been lit along the harbor. Their warm glow reflected upon the calm water, stretching into long ribbons that danced with every passing ripple. As they approached the docks, they found Jarl Hakon waiting beside Bjorn. Both men had already heard Sten's report. "You are certain?" Hakon asked. "I've spent 43 years watching this coast," the old lookout replied. "I've learned not to mistake birds for ships." Bjorn looked toward the west. 3 following 1. Yes, and the first vessel was faster. Much faster. Halvard, who had joined them only moments earlier, quietly exhaled. "Then they've begun." No one asked what he meant. Not yet. That night, the meeting hall filled once more. This time, nearly every adult in the village attended. The great fire burned brightly at the center of the room, pushing back the evening chill as people settled onto long benches. Jarl Hakon stood before them. My friends, his voice carried easily. Our village has always lived by the sea. A quiet murmur of agreement followed. It has fed us, protected us, and, at times, tested us. He paused, allowing his gaze to travel across familiar faces. I will not hide the truth. Several people straightened. There are strangers upon the western waters. You already know that. What you do not know, he glanced briefly toward Bjorn, is that those strangers are searching for something connected to one of our own. The hall became completely silent. No accusations followed, no angry voices, only surprise. Hakon continued. Bjorn has shared with me enough of his past that I believe him. He also believes those strangers may eventually bring danger to our shores. One of the older fishermen slowly stood. Then we should prepare. Another nodded. We've weathered storms before. So we shall again. A blacksmith raised one broad hand. My forge belongs to the village. Whatever weapons are needed, they'll be ready. Others followed. Boat builders, hunters, shepherds, women who offered to prepare dried food if longships had to sail. No one spoke of abandoning the village. It was simply never considered. Eirik looked around the hall with quiet admiration. These were ordinary people. Yet in that moment, they seemed as steadfast as the mountains surrounding the fjord. Later, when the gathering ended, Bjorn remained behind with Hakon and Halvard. Eirik waited outside beneath the stars. Leif soon joined him. Everyone keeps talking inside. They've earned 30 years to catch up. Leif leaned against one of the carved pillars supporting the roof. I've been thinking. That's dangerous. I know. He grinned. If your father sails west? He hesitated. Do you think he'll leave without us? Eirik looked toward the quiet harbor. The question had haunted him since the previous evening. I don't know. Leif folded his arms. I do. What? He'll try. And Leif smiled. We'll probably make it difficult. Near midnight, Bjorn finally stepped outside. He appeared more tired than Eirik had ever seen him. Without a word, father and son began walking home beneath the moonlight. Halfway there, Bjorn suddenly stopped. I spoke with the Jarl. And? He asked me to prepare. For war? No, for a voyage. Eirik's heart quickened. When? As soon as the ship is ready. The words hung in the cool night air. You said you'd never sail west again. I did. What changed? Bjorn looked toward the sea. I finally understood something. What? I spent 31 years believing I could protect this village by hiding from my past. He smiled sadly. I was wrong. The waves whispered softly below the cliffs. Some journeys follow you, no matter how far you run. The next morning, the entire harbor awakened before sunrise. Carpenters worked by torchlight. Smiths reheated iron fittings. Sailmakers stitched through the last hours of darkness. The great longship stood at the center of it all, like a sleeping beast slowly preparing to wake. Eirik carried fresh rope toward the vessel when he noticed Bjorn speaking quietly with Hakon. The Jarl nodded once. Then both men turned toward him. Eirik. Yes? Bjorn walked closer. His expression remained calm. The ship will need young hands. Hope rose instantly inside Eirik. But his father's next words struck harder than any blow. Not yours. For a long moment, Eirik could not speak. He simply stared. I forbid you from joining this voyage. The harbor seemed to fall silent around him. Leif, standing only a few steps away, looked equally stunned. Eirik searched his father's face for some hint that he might change his mind. There was none. Bjorn had already made his decision, and for the first time in his life, Eirik realized that the greatest obstacle standing between him and the Western Sea was not the ocean. It was his own father. For a long moment, Eirik could not answer. The sounds of the shipyard slowly returned around him. The ringing of hammers, the scrape of saws against oak, the hiss of hot pitch poured into narrow seams. Men continued working as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet, to Eirik, everything had changed. "You can't mean that," he said quietly. Bjorn held his gaze. "I do. You've spent days telling me the truth." "Yes." "You've shown me the map." "Yes." "You've shown me the sword." "I have." "And now you expect me to stay behind?" "I expect you to live." The answer struck harder than Eirik expected. "I am not a child." "I know. I'm 19. I know. I can row. I know. I've fished these waters since I was old enough to hold an oar." Bjorn nodded. "You have? Then why?" His father's expression softened. "Because I have already watched too many young men disappear beyond that horizon." Silence settled between them. Leif quietly stepped away, pretending to inspect a stack of oars. The other craftsmen wisely kept their attention on their work, though Eirik knew they could hear every word. "I won't lose my son," Bjorn said at last. "Not if I still have a choice." Without another word, he turned back toward the longship. The conversation was over. Eirik spent the rest of the morning carrying timber from the forest to the shipyard. The physical work usually cleared his thoughts. Today it did nothing of the sort. Every plank he lifted reminded him that a ship was being prepared. Every hammer blow echoed like a countdown. When the midday meal was called, he wandered away from the harbor instead of joining the others. His feet carried him toward the stream flowing through the birch woods east of the village. He had often come there as a boy. The water was clear enough to reveal every smooth stone beneath its surface. Small trout darted through the current, disappearing beneath tangled roots whenever his shadow crossed the stream. He sat upon a fallen log. For the first time in many years, he felt completely uncertain. Not because he feared the sea, because he feared being left behind. "You've worn a path into the grass." Eirik looked up. Old Torsten approached slowly, carrying a bundle of carved fence posts over one shoulder. I wasn't expecting company. Neither was I. The old man lowered the posts onto the ground and sat beside him with a quiet sigh. "I heard. The whole village probably has." Torsten smiled. "News travels faster than ravens." For a while they simply listened to the stream. "You know," Torsten finally said, "when I was younger, I desperately wanted to join every voyage that left this fjord." "Did you?" "Only one. And I hated it." Eirik looked at him in surprise. "You?" "I was seasick for 4 days." That earned the first genuine laugh Eirik had managed since morning. Torsten chuckled as well. Not every destiny begins with excitement. His smile faded, but some begin with disappointment. Meanwhile, work upon the longship continued without pause. Bjorn moved from one section of the vessel to another, inspecting every repair personally. The mast, the rudder, the steering oar, the sail yard. Nothing escaped his attention. Halvard joined him near the bow. "You handled that poorly." "I know." "You could have explained." He would still ask to come. "Yes." And I would still refuse. Halvard rested both hands upon the railing. "You see yourself in him." Bjorn stared toward the sea. "That's exactly why I refuse." Late that afternoon, Jarl Hakon ordered the crew to test the rebuilt rigging. The great square sail climbed slowly into the wind. Canvas snapped sharply before filling with a deep, powerful breath. The entire longship leaned gently against her moorings. Several old sailors smiled. "She remembers," one whispered. Bjorn placed his hand upon the railing. For just an instant, he was no longer standing in the village. He was 19 again, a younger man, a younger sea, a different voyage. He could almost hear Captain Arna laughing somewhere behind him. The memory vanished as quickly as it had come. That evening, Eirik returned home after sunset. Astrid was kneading bread beside the hearth. She looked at him only once before understanding. "You argued?" "Yes." He said no. "Yes." She dusted flour from her hands and sat beside him. "When your father left on his first great voyage, his own father forbade him to go." Eirik blinked. "He never told me that." "No. What happened?" Astrid smiled faintly. "He went anyway." Hope flickered inside Eirik, but it disappeared when she gently touched his arm. He regretted the way he left, for the rest of his life. She waited until Eirik met her eyes. "Think carefully before you choose how your own story begins." Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of the sea through the open doorway. From the harbor came the distant sound of the great longship's hull shifting gently against its moorings. Ready, waiting, and hidden beyond the western horizon, where no one in the village could yet see them, 3 unfamiliar longships entered a powerful ocean current that would carry them straight toward the same forgotten destination. Though none of their crews realized it, they were no longer the only ones racing to reach it. The following days passed with unusual purpose. From sunrise until long after dusk, the village echoed with the sounds of preparation. Axes split fresh timber in the forest. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron into rivets and spearheads, and sailmakers worked until their fingers grew stiff from pulling heavy thread through thick linen. The great longship slowly transformed. Each repaired plank, each polished oar, each coil of fresh rope brought her one step closer to the sea. No one announced the day of departure. No one needed to. The village could feel it approaching. Eirik threw himself into work. If he could not sail, he refused to spend his days sulking. He helped strengthen the storage sheds where dried fish would be kept through winter. He carried barrels of fresh water from the spring, stacked split firewood behind neighboring homes, and spent hours repairing lobster traps with several elderly fishermen. His hands remained busy. His thoughts did not. Every time he passed the harbor, he caught himself counting the crew: Bjorn, Halvard, Jarl Hakon, Old Finn, whose eyesight remained sharp despite his gray beard, Olaf the shipwright, Ketil, the strongest oarsman in the village. Only 12 men. There was still room aboard. That realization lingered in his mind far longer than it should have. Late one afternoon, Bjorn found him repairing a net beside the shoreline. Without speaking, he sat down opposite his son and picked up a wooden shuttle. For several minutes they worked together, weaving fresh cord through torn mesh exactly as they had done hundreds of times before. The sea whispered softly against the stones. A cormorant surfaced nearby with a silver fish in its beak before disappearing beneath the waves again. Finally, Bjorn broke the silence. "My father taught me this knot." His hands moved steadily. "He said a good knot should never draw attention to itself." Eirik nodded. "It simply does its work." "Exactly." Another few moments passed. "When I was your age," Bjorn continued, "I believed strength meant refusing to listen. And now, I think strength often begins by listening longer than you wish to." Eirik looked up. You still aren't changing your mind. No. The answer was calm, not harsh, not angry, simply certain. I wish you would understand. I understand why you're afraid. Bjorn's hands stopped moving. I'm not afraid for myself. I know. The older man smiled sadly. Then perhaps you understand more than I did at 19. That evening, Leif appeared carrying 2 fishing rods over one shoulder. If the world insists on becoming mysterious, he declared, we should at least eat well while it does. Eirik laughed. So we're fishing? We're pretending to. They followed a narrow path along the eastern shore where a quiet inlet sheltered beneath steep cliffs. Few people came there except fishermen and children searching for shells after storms. The water lay almost perfectly still. Leif cast his line with exaggerated confidence. I'll catch the largest trout in the fjord. You've said that every spring. And one day I'll be right. For nearly an hour they sat together beneath the fading sun. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they simply watched the water. The silence between them had never required filling. I've made a decision, Leif said at last. Eirik glanced toward him. If your father sails— He paused before continuing. I'm going. Eirik frowned. He hasn't asked you. I know. He'll probably refuse. I know. Then why? Leif looked toward the western horizon where the sky had begun turning amber. Because if I spend the rest of my life wondering what waited beyond that horizon. He smiled faintly. I'll never forgive myself. The words struck Eirik more deeply than he expected, not because they encouraged him, because they echoed his own thoughts almost perfectly. Night settled gently over the fjord. As the 2 friends walked home, they noticed unusual activity near the northern cliffs. Several watchfires had already been lit, though darkness had only just begun to fall. They're early, Leif observed. They are. Before they reached the village, a young watchman came running down the hillside. His breathing was heavy. There are ships. People immediately emerged from nearby houses. How many? Someone called. The watchman struggled to catch his breath. I counted 4. A murmur swept through the gathering crowd. 4? I thought there were 3. There were. The young man nodded quickly. There are 4 now. Bjorn and Jarl Håkon arrived almost immediately. Neither man wasted a moment. Sound the harbor bell, Håkon ordered. Post watches on every cliff. No fires along the western beach tonight. The village sprang into motion with calm efficiency. Doors were secured. Children guided indoors. Torches shielded from the sea. No panic spread. Only determination. Eirik climbed halfway up the western path before stopping beside Sten's watchtower. The old lookout handed him the polished whalebone viewing tube without a word. Far beyond the mouth of the fjord, faint against the last light of day, 4 distant sails moved slowly across the sea. But they were not sailing toward the village. They were following the coastline, heading north, almost as though searching for something hidden among the cliffs. Sten quietly lowered his own gaze. They're not looking for a harbor. Eirik felt a chill. What are they looking for? The old watchman remained silent. Then, pointing toward a narrow stretch of rugged shoreline that few villagers ever visited, he whispered, The old landing. A place no ship had used since the year Bjorn returned alone from the western sea. The old landing. Eirik lowered the whalebone tube and turned toward Sten. I've never heard anyone call it that. Most people your age haven't. The old watchman kept his eyes fixed upon the distant sails. The path has almost disappeared now. So why would strangers know about it? Sten did not answer immediately. A cold wind swept across the cliff, carrying the smell of salt and kelp from the darkening sea below. When I was a boy, he finally said, that cove was used by every ship returning from the western fishing grounds. It was deeper then and sheltered from the strongest northern winds. What happened? The sea changed. Those words echoed the ones Bjorn had spoken only days before. Not the island. The sea. One winter, Steen continued, a storm buried much of the inlet beneath fallen rock. The current shifted. Larger ships stopped using it. But someone remembers. Someone always remembers. By the time Eirik and Sten reached the village, the harbor had become a place of quiet purpose. No one shouted. No one ran in panic. The villagers moved with the calm determination of people who understood that fear accomplished very little. Women carried baskets of dried fish, smoked meat, oats and barley toward the longship waiting beneath the shipyard shelter. The blacksmith hammered out the final iron nails needed to reinforce several oarlocks. Young boys carried bundles of spare rope over their shoulders, proudly helping despite their small size. Astrid stood with several other women, carefully wrapping medicinal herbs into linen cloth. Yarrow, juniper, willow bark, dried moss for bandages. She looked up as Eirik approached. "You've seen the ships?" "Yes. They're heading north." Her hands paused only for a heartbeat. "So it begins." Inside the meeting hall, Jarl Håkon spread a rough map of the surrounding coastline across the great oak table. Oil lamps burned low as the leaders of the village gathered around it. Bjorn rested one finger upon a narrow inlet hidden between steep cliffs. The old landing. Håkon nodded. Could they reach it? In calm weather. And tonight? Bjorn considered the wind. The tide favors them. Halvard quietly folded his arms. If they know about that cove, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Ragnvald, standing near the doorway, completed the thought. Then someone has shown them more than old legends. The room fell silent. Bjorn looked sharply toward him. You believe there's another map? I believe there are several. The monastery. Not only the monastery. Ragnvald's face grew grave. Our captain wasn't the only man who copied his journals. A heavy silence settled over the table. For 30 years, Bjorn had believed the knowledge had died with those who vanished. Now that certainty was crumbling. Outside, darkness settled completely over the fjord. The moon had not yet risen. Clouds drifted slowly across the stars, leaving long stretches of shoreline hidden in shadow. Eirik could not sleep. He wandered toward the harbor where the great longship rested quietly against her moorings. A lantern burned near the bow. Beside it sat Bjorn alone. He was sharpening neither sword nor axe. Instead, he carefully sanded the smooth wooden handle of a steering oar. You couldn't sleep either, Eirik said. Bjorn smiled without looking up. Not tonight. Eirik sat beside him. For several minutes they watched the black water move gently beneath the dock. When I was little, Eirik said softly, you told me that every ship has its own voice. I remember. You said you could recognize your boat in complete darkness. I still can. Eirik rested a hand on the railing of the longship. And this one? Bjorn's fingers stopped moving. This ship reminds me of another. The Sea Wolf? His father nodded. She wasn't larger. She wasn't faster. But she carried men who believed tomorrow would be better than yesterday. A faint smile touched his face. We argued over foolish things. The best fishing spots. Who snored the loudest? Which harbor brewed the strongest ale? His smile slowly disappeared. I can still remember every one of their voices. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words. I've never asked, Eirik whispered. How many came home? Bjorn closed his eyes. 5. And how many left? He answered almost immediately. 24. The numbers settled between them like cold stone. For the first time, Eirik truly understood why his father feared the Western Sea. It was not because of monsters, or curses, or forgotten prophecies. It was because he had already buried 19 friends in his heart. Just before dawn, while the village still slept, a small rowing boat slipped quietly into the hidden cove known as the Old Landing. No lantern marked its arrival. No voices broke the silence. 3 cloaked figures stepped ashore. One carried a sealed leather case. Another held a narrow bronze tube wrapped in oilcloth. The third paused only long enough to study the cliffs above them. Then he smiled. They haven't forgotten the place, he said in a low voice. No, replied the oldest of the 3, but they've forgotten to guard it. Together they disappeared into the pine forest, moving toward the village before the first light of morning reached the fjord. The village awoke before sunrise. A pale gray light spread slowly across the fjord, revealing a shoreline that seemed unchanged. Fishing boats still rested beside the docks. Smoke rose from the chimneys. The familiar scent of damp timber and the sea drifted through the cool morning air. Only those who had stood watch during the night knew that everything had changed. Jarl Håkon called his council together before the first meal. The meeting was brief. The strangers landed before dawn, Steen reported. 3 men, no more. Did anyone follow them? Håkon asked. I sent 2 hunters, and they found tracks. Where do they lead? Sten looked toward Bjorn, toward the old shrine. No one spoke. Bjorn closed his eyes for a moment. They're looking for confirmation. Confirmation of what? Eirik asked. That I truly lived here. Halvard nodded. They've already found it. The hunters returned shortly after sunrise. Mud stained their boots, and pine needles clung to their cloaks. The tracks vanished near the standing stones, one of them reported. Vanished? Hakon repeated. We searched every path. The ground was soft enough to hold the clear footprints. They simply stopped. Several men exchanged doubtful looks. People don't disappear. No, Bjorn said quietly. They don't. The answer was calm, but it carried a certainty that made the room fall silent. Outside, the village continued preparing the longship. Food barrels were loaded into the hold. Water casks were tied securely beneath the rowing benches. Bundles of spare sailcloth, coils of rope, fishing gear, hunting bows, and iron tools disappeared one by one into the vessel's belly. It no longer looked like a ship prepared for a short voyage. It looked ready to leave the known world. Eirik helped carry a heavy barrel of smoked cod aboard. As he climbed back onto the dock, Olaf the shipwright stopped him. Feel this. He placed Eirik's hand against the side of the hull. The oak felt warm beneath the morning sun. She's alive, Olaf said proudly. My father says every good ship is. He taught me that. Olaf smiled. He taught many of us. For a moment, Eirik imagined the longship cutting through unknown seas, her sail full beneath a western wind. Then he remembered he was not meant to be aboard. That afternoon, Bjorn walked alone to the cliff overlooking the fjord. He often came there when difficult decisions waited for him. From that height he could see almost the entire village. Children chasing dogs through the grass, women hanging wool blankets to dry, fishermen mending nets exactly as they had the day before. Everything he loved, everything he hoped to protect. Footsteps approached behind him. It was Jarl Håkon. "You haven't changed your mind." Bjorn smiled without turning. "No. You know he'll follow if you leave him." "I know. Then why not bring him?" Bjorn remained silent. Håkon rested both hands on the weathered stone wall. "When I was younger, my father believed he could protect me from every danger." "Could he?" "No." The old Jarl looked toward the sea. "He only protected me from becoming the man I needed to be." Those words lingered in the wind. Bjorn lowered his head. "I've buried 19 friends." "I know. I can still remember every face." "I know. I cannot bear the thought of adding my son to them." Håkon spoke gently. "You cannot choose the sea. No. You can only choose whether he meets it beside you." The Jarl paused. "Or without you." As evening approached, the village gathered for one final shared meal before the expected departure. Long tables filled the square beneath the great ash tree. Fresh bread was passed from hand to hand. Steaming bowls of barley stew warmed cold fingers. Children laughed. Unaware that many of the adults were quietly memorizing ordinary moments they feared might soon become precious memories. Old Asger lifted his harp. This time he did not sing of distant voyages. He sang of home, of small harbors hidden between mountains, of mothers waiting beside the shore, of fathers teaching sons to row before they were tall enough to reach the water. The melody settled gently over the village. More than one hardened fisherman wiped moisture from his eyes while pretending the evening wind was to blame. Eirik glanced toward his father. Bjorn was listening with the same distant expression he wore whenever old memories returned. For the first time, Eirik understood that courage did not mean feeling no fear. Sometimes it meant walking toward the thing that frightened you most, because those you loved stood behind you. Night fell. One by one. The villagers returned to their homes. Only the watchfires remained burning upon the western cliffs. Eirik found sleep impossible. He dressed quietly, slipped outside, and wandered toward the harbor. The tide was low. Moonlight shimmered across the mudflats between the rocks. As he passed the great longship, he froze. Someone was aboard. A dark figure moved silently near the stern, crouching beside the steering oar. Not one of the village guards. Not one of the crew. The stranger looked around carefully before reaching beneath his cloak and fastening something small beneath the ship's railing. Then, without making the slightest sound, the figure slipped back over the side of the vessel and disappeared into the darkness. Eirik waited only long enough to be certain the intruder was gone. Then he ran. Not toward home. Not toward the meeting hall. Straight toward his father. Because whatever had just been hidden aboard the longship had been placed there before the voyage even began. Eirik ran as fast as the darkness would allow. The narrow path from the harbor twisted between longhouses and stacks of split firewood before climbing gently toward his family's home. Moonlight slipped between drifting clouds, offering only brief glimpses of the ground beneath his feet. His breath came hard, not from the distance, from urgency. He burst through the wooden door without knocking. Bjorn was awake. So was Astrid. Years at sea had taught Bjorn never to sleep deeply when uncertainty hung over a village. "What happened?" he asked, already standing. "Someone was on the ship." The room became still. "I saw him." "Who?" "I don't know. He climbed aboard." He hid something beneath the steering platform. Bjorn did not ask another question. He reached for his cloak, fastened his belt, and took the old sword from the sea chest. Astrid stepped toward him. "Be careful." Bjorn nodded once. Always. Within minutes, they reached the harbor. 2 watchmen hurried to meet them. "No one has passed us," one insisted. "They didn't use the road," Eirik answered. "They crossed the docks." Bjorn climbed aboard the longship without hesitation. A lantern was lit beneath the mast, its warm glow revealing coils of rope, neatly stacked barrels, spare oars, and the carefully packed supplies that would sustain the voyage. Everything appeared untouched, until Bjorn knelt beside the steering platform. There. He reached beneath the heavy timber. His fingers closed around something wrapped tightly in dark leather. Slowly, he drew it into the lantern light. It was a small wooden box sealed with black wax. No markings, no crest, no name, only a single shallow carving burned into the lid. A circle, surrounded by 7 tiny stars. The same symbol. Bjorn stared at it for several long breaths. Halvard, awakened by the commotion, climbed aboard just as Bjorn broke the wax seal. Inside lay 3 objects: a narrow bronze key, a folded strip of parchment, and a raven feather, perfectly black. Halvard's face lost all color. No. Bjorn unfolded the parchment. Only 1 sentence had been written, not in Norse, not in Latin, but in the same unknown script carved upon the pale stone. Beneath it, however, someone had added a single line in familiar runes. "You are already too late." Silence settled across the deck. Even the sea seemed to stop breathing. Before dawn, Jarl Håkon ordered every path leading into the village searched. Hunters spread through the surrounding forests. Others followed the shoreline toward the old landing. They found footprints, broken branches, fresh boot marks. Then, nothing. The strangers had vanished as completely as morning mist beneath the sunlight. "They're watching us," Halvard said. "They've been watching us since before Ragnvald arrived." Bjorn folded the parchment carefully. "No. They wanted us to find this." The first light of morning painted the mountains pale gold. Despite the night's events, the village could wait no longer. The tide, the wind, the weather, all favored departure. If they delayed another day, autumn storms might close the western sea for weeks. Jarl Håkon gathered the chosen crew beside the great longship. 12 men stood ready. Each carried little more than a sea chest, weapons, warm clothing, and the quiet determination that came from accepting uncertainty. The villagers gathered nearby. Some smiled. Some embraced loved ones. Others stood silently, unwilling to trust their voices. Astrid placed a small leather pouch into Bjorn's hands. "Dried herbs. You remembered." "I always do." She straightened the collar of his cloak exactly as she had done countless mornings before ordinary fishing trips. Only this journey was anything but ordinary. Eirik remained several steps away. He had promised himself he would not argue again. His father had spoken. The decision had been made. Bjorn approached him. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Bjorn removed something from beneath his own cloak, the pale stone. He placed it in Eirik's hands. "I can't take this. You must. You said it never leaves you. It shouldn't." "Then why?" Bjorn closed Eirik's fingers around it. "If I don't return, I'm not listening. You will." His voice remained gentle. "You'll remember everything I've told you." Eirik shook his head. "You're coming home." Bjorn smiled. "I intend to." For the first time in many days, Father and son embraced. Neither spoke. Words were too small for that moment. The crew climbed aboard. Ropes were untied. The great square sail waited furled against the yard. Villagers stepped back from the water's edge. Jarl Håkon raised one hand. Cast off. The first rope splashed into the sea. The longship drifted slowly away from the dock. Eirik stood motionless, the pale stone still warm in his hand. Everything inside him wanted to leap aboard. Everything. The ship moved farther into the harbor. Bjorn stood near the stern, one hand resting upon the steering oar. For a brief moment, father and son looked at one another across the widening stretch of water. Then a shout echoed from the western cliffs. So many ships. Every head turned. Out beyond the mouth of the fjord, where the morning mist had only begun to lift, 4 unfamiliar longships appeared in perfect formation. Behind them, emerging slowly from the fog, came a 5th vessel. Older, larger. Its sail was almost black, and carved into its towering prow was the same circle surrounded by 7 stars. The ship did not slow. It sailed directly toward the entrance of the fjord, as though it no longer cared whether the village knew it had arrived. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The 5 ships advanced through the thinning mist with slow, deliberate confidence. Their oars rose and fell together, cutting the sea in perfect rhythm. No war cries echoed across the water. No shields were raised along their rails. Their silence was more unsettling than any roar. "They're entering the fjord," Sten whispered. Jarl Håkon's voice rang across the harbor. "Raise the sail." The crew sprang into motion. The great square sail climbed the mast as men hauled on thick ropes with practiced strength. Canvas snapped sharply before filling with the fresh morning wind. Bjorn never took his eyes off the approaching fleet. "They're not here to raid." Halvard stood beside him. "No, they're here to stop us." The realization spread quickly among the crew. If the strangers had wished to burn the village, they could have landed during the night. Instead, they had waited until the longship was ready to depart. Someone wanted the expedition delayed, or ended. The black-sailed vessel broke formation. While the other 4 ships continued slowly toward the fjord, the larger ship altered course just enough to pass across its entrance, blocking it, like a gate closing. Ragnvald narrowed his eyes. He learned. Bjorn looked at him. "Who?" "The man who commands that ship. You know him." I prayed I never would again. Ragnvald's face had become strangely pale. "He was only a navigator when we first sailed west." "What is his name?" For several moments, Ragnvald remained silent. Then he answered, "Alrik." The name stirred no recognition among the younger men. Among the older ones, however, several exchanged uneasy glances. Halvard spoke quietly. "I thought he died with Captain Arna." "So did everyone else." Back on shore, Eirik watched the harbor transform within moments. Women hurried children away from the waterfront. Older villagers carried water buckets toward the nearest houses in case fire arrows followed. The blacksmith distributed spears to men who rarely carried weapons outside hunting season. No panic, only preparation. Astrid stepped beside Eirik. "Your father won't leave now." "I know." She noticed the pale stone still resting in his hand. "He gave it to you." "Yes." She touched the cloth wrapped around it. Then he already feared this day. The distance between the ships continued to shrink. At last, the black-sailed vessel lowered its oars. A single figure stepped onto the raised foredeck. He wore no helmet, no mail, only a dark blue cloak fastened with a simple silver brooch. His hair, though streaked with gray, still reached his shoulders. He looked less like a conqueror than a man entirely certain of his purpose. He raised one empty hand. "I ask for Bjorn, son of Einar." His voice carried astonishingly well across the calm water. No one answered. Again he called. "I did not cross the western sea to fight your village." Jarl Hakon stepped forward. "You sail armed into my fjord. I sail with caution. You block my harbor. I block one ship." The old Jarl's expression hardened. "That ship belongs to my people, and the man aboard it belongs to history." Bjorn stepped to the bow before Hakon could reply. "I remember you." Eirik inclined his head. "And I remember you." For a long moment, the two men simply studied one another across the water. 31 years of silence stood between them. At last, Eirik spoke again. "You've hidden long enough. I wasn't hiding. You vanished. I chose another life, and yet the sea has called you back." Bjorn's hand tightened around the railing. "What do you want?" "The same thing I wanted when we were young. The truth." Bjorn laughed once. It held no joy. The truth buried 19 good men. It also buried something else. Eirik slowly reached inside his cloak. Every warrior in the village instinctively gripped his weapon. Instead of a blade, he withdrew a small object wrapped in faded linen. He unfolded it carefully. Even from the shore, Eirik recognized it, a pale stone, identical to the one hidden beneath his own cloak. Eirik lifted it toward the light. "We each carried one away." His voice remained calm. "You, Ragnvald, Halvard, and me." He paused. "But there was always meant to be." His eyes found Eirik standing beside Astrid on the shore, a fifth bearer. Every instinct inside Bjorn screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. Eirik had not come for revenge. He had not come for war. He had come for Eirik. A silence settled over the fjord, so complete that even the gulls seemed unwilling to break it. Every eye turned toward Eirik. He instinctively stepped back, his hand tightening around the cloth hidden beneath his cloak. He had not realized he was clutching the pale stone until its smooth edge pressed into his palm. Eirik had seen it. There was no doubt. Bjorn moved immediately. He stepped between the longship and the shore, placing himself squarely in the line of sight between Eirik and his son. "You will not speak to him." Eirik did not argue. Instead, he lowered his stone with unexpected care. "I have no quarrel with the boy. You have no right to involve him." "I didn't." "You already have." The older man's face softened with genuine regret. "No, Bjorn." "The sea did." Those words unsettled even Ragnvald. For the first time since returning to the village, he looked genuinely uncertain. Jarl Hakon broke the silence. "You came into my waters. You blocked my harbor. And now you speak in riddles." His voice carried the calm authority of a leader who had weathered more winters than most men present. "I'll ask only once. State your purpose." Eirik inclined his head respectfully. "My purpose is not conquest, nor revenge. I came because another fleet is already sailing." Ragnvald nodded grimly. "I told him." Eirik continued. "They are larger than mine. They do not seek knowledge. They seek possession." Murmurs spread across both crews. "Possession of what?" Hakon asked. "The place beyond the western sea. The place we once swore would remain forgotten." Bjorn's expression hardened. It should have remained forgotten. So we believed. Eirik looked toward the horizon beyond the fjord. But forgotten places have a way of calling curious men. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of open water farther into the harbor. The symbols, the maps, the stories, they have spread farther than we imagined. We can no longer hide them. Bjorn closed his eyes. I spent 31 years trying. I know. And you failed. I know. Neither accusation nor anger filled Alric's voice. Only sadness. On the shore, Eirik watched the men who had once sailed together. For years he had imagined his father as a simple fisherman who had once enjoyed adventure in his youth. Now he saw something entirely different. These men were not enemies. They were survivors. Each carried the same invisible burden. Each had spent decades trying to outrun the same memory. Astrid quietly stepped beside her son. "Do you see them now?" Eirik nodded. They all came home. She looked toward Bjorn. "No, they only survived. There is a difference." Without warning, Steen shouted from the western cliffs. More sails. Every head turned. This time, no one needed the whalebone tube. Far beyond Alric's ships, dark shapes emerged one after another from the morning haze. Not 4, not 5. Too many to count at first. Then the wind shifted, clearing the mist. 8 longships, larger than any the villagers had ever seen. They sailed in 2 disciplined lines, their crimson sails glowing beneath the rising sun. No fishing vessel could mistake them. No trader traveled with such formation. This was a fleet, a true fleet. Ragnvald's face drained of color. "They've arrived sooner than I feared." Halvard whispered a quiet prayer beneath his breath. Even Jarl Hakon understood immediately. His village could never defeat so many ships. Not alone. Alrik looked directly at Bjorn. "The choice is over. There is no longer your voyage and mine. There is only ours." Bjorn stared at the approaching fleet. He had spent half his life refusing to return to the Western Sea. Now the sea had returned for him. Slowly, very slowly. He turned toward the shore, toward Astrid, toward Eirik, toward the home he had built with such care. Then he made the hardest decision of his life. Eirik. His son's head lifted. "Come aboard." For a heartbeat, Eirik could not move. He wondered if he had imagined the words. Bjorn's voice came again, stronger this time. "Bring the stone. You sail with us." The village stood frozen. Leif's eyes widened into a grin of disbelief. Astrid closed her eyes, fighting back tears she had known would one day come. Eirik looked once at his mother. She smiled through the fear. "Go." He ran, across the dock, past the waiting villagers, over the narrow gangplank. His boots struck the deck of the longship just as the first warning horn echoed across the fjord. Behind them, 8 crimson-sailed ships continued their relentless advance. Ahead of them lay the endless Western Sea. For the first time in his life, Eirik no longer stood at the edge of someone else's story. The voyage had finally become his own. The gangplank thudded against the deck as Eirik crossed it in 3 hurried strides. For a heartbeat, he simply stood there. The familiar harbor that had framed his entire life suddenly looked different from the deck of the great longship. The roofs of the village seemed smaller. The cliffs rose higher than he remembered. The scent of pine smoke drifted across the water, mingling with tar, salt, and fresh-cut oak. This was no longer the view of a fisherman. It was the view of a sailor about to leave home. Bjorn walked toward him. "You came quickly. You called." "I did." For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Bjorn placed both hands on Eirik's shoulders. "What I'm about to ask of you is harder than rowing." Eirik listened carefully. Harder than fighting. What is it? You will obey every order I give. I will. No matter how much you disagree. I understand. If I tell you to hide, I'll hide. If I tell you to run, I'll run. And if I tell you to leave me behind, Eirik answered before thinking, I won't. Bjorn sighed softly. I knew you'd say that. The warning horns echoed once more from the cliffs. Across the fjord, villagers hurried away from the shoreline while the remaining warriors formed a loose defensive line near the docks. The approaching fleet had not increased its speed. It did not need to. Its confidence alone unsettled everyone who watched. Alric's ships slowly turned aside, opening a narrow passage toward the western sea. Jarl Hakon looked across the water. You trust him? Bjorn considered the question. No. But I trust the fear in his eyes. That answer was enough. Hakon raised his arm. Cast loose. The mooring ropes splashed into the water. 8 pairs of oars slipped over the sides. Ready, the crew answered together. Ready, pull. The first stroke carried the longship away from the harbor. A second followed, then another. Each pull widened the distance between the ship and the shore Eirik had always called home. Astrid remained at the water's edge. She did not wave. She simply watched until the distance became too great to distinguish individual faces. Beside her stood Leif. He looked from the departing longship to the village, then back again. This feels wrong. Astrid smiled sadly. It does. He shouldn't leave alone. No. Leif looked at her. I wasn't talking about Bjorn. She understood immediately. You were talking about Eirik. Leif nodded. He'll need someone to remind him how foolish he can be. Despite everything, Astrid laughed quietly. So will you. Out upon the open water, the wind freshened. The square sail billowed, and the great ship leaned gently as it found its rhythm. The village slowly disappeared behind the headland. Eirik stood near the starboard rail, watching until the last glimpse of the ash tree vanished behind the cliffs. Only then did he realize he had left home without looking back one final time. A quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. Your hands. He turned. Halvard stood beside him. You're gripping the railing too tightly. Eirik released it. I didn't notice. Most first voyages begin that way. Halvard smiled warmly. You're trying to hold on to land. By midday, the coastline stretched like a dark ribbon behind them. Ahead lay nothing but open sea. The swell grew longer, deeper. The ship rose and fell with slow, patient movements that felt entirely different from the sheltered waters of the fjord. Bjorn gathered the younger crew near the mast. The sea beyond our coast has its own rules. He pointed toward the sail. Watch it. The men looked upward. You do not fight the wind. You listen to it. He pointed toward the water. And you never judge the sea by its surface. Several of the older sailors nodded knowingly. The calmest water may hide the strongest current. The roughest waves may carry you safely home. Eirik absorbed every word. This was not merely sailing. It was a language, and he had only just begun learning it. Toward evening, dark clouds gathered far to the northwest. Not a storm. Not yet. Just a reminder that the ocean was larger than any man aboard. Ragnvald joined Bjorn near the stern. They're following. Bjorn glanced behind them. On the distant horizon, the crimson sails remained visible. They're keeping their distance. They're waiting. For what? Ragnvald looked west. For us to find it first. The answer sent a chill through everyone close enough to hear. Night descended slowly across the sea. The first stars emerged one by one above the mast. Eirik remembered the strange symbols carved into the pale stone hidden beneath his cloak. Circles, stars, lines. For the first time, he looked up from the deck and wondered whether the sky itself had been trying to tell a story all along. Just then, the ship's navigator called quietly from the bow. "Captain." Bjorn stepped forward. "What is it?" The navigator pointed toward the western horizon. There, beneath the rising moon, the ocean had become unnaturally smooth. Not calm, still, as though an invisible hand had pressed every wave flat. Bjorn's face grew pale. Without taking his eyes off the water, he spoke the words he had hoped never to say again. "We've reached the sleeping sea." No one aboard the longship spoke. The waves behind them continued their slow, familiar rhythm, lifting and lowering the stern with the steady breath of the open ocean. Ahead, nothing moved. The sea stretched westward like polished obsidian beneath the moonlight. No white foam crowned its surface. No wind carved ripples through the water. It reflected the stars so perfectly that the horizon almost disappeared, leaving sky and sea joined into one endless darkness. Eirik had never seen anything like it. "It looks peaceful," he whispered. Bjorn heard him. So did we. The answer carried no comfort. Jarl Hakon stepped to the bow beside Bjorn. "This is what you spoke of." Bjorn nodded. "The sleeping sea. I always believed it was only a sailor's tale." So did Captain Arne. Ragnvald quietly joined them. "The first day we laughed. The second day we argued. The third—" He fell silent. "What happened on the third day?" Eirik asked. No one agreed where we were. The younger sailors exchanged puzzled glances. Our navigator swore we had sailed west. The helmsman insisted the stars had carried us north. The sun told another story. Bjorn looked toward the silent water. Every answer was correct, and every answer was impossible. The longship approached the boundary cautiously. Bjorn raised one hand. "Lower the sail." The crew obeyed immediately. Canvas folded against the yard. The wind that had carried them all day still blew steadily from behind, yet the moment the ship crossed into the smooth water, its speed fell away. It drifted, not because the wind had stopped, because the sea no longer seemed willing to carry it. Even the older sailors noticed. Olaf dipped an oar into the water. "It feels heavier." "No," Halvard replied softly. "It feels deeper." No one laughed. Night watches were doubled. No songs were sung. Even Leif, who usually found a joke in every difficult moment, sat quietly beside a barrel, staring at the perfectly still horizon. Eirik joined him. "You've gone unusually silent." Leif smiled weakly. "I've been trying to think of something cheerful. And I've failed." That earned the smallest laugh from Eirik. Leif looked upward. "Do the stars seem brighter to you?" Eirik followed his gaze. They did, thousands of them, more than he had ever noticed from the village. Their reflections shimmered beneath the ship until it seemed they were sailing through the night sky itself. He reached beneath his cloak and removed the pale stone. Moonlight touched its carved surface. The tiny circles and lines appeared almost identical to the heavens above. Halvard noticed immediately. "May I?" Eirik handed him the stone. The old traveler studied it in silence. Then he slowly raised it toward the stars. Something unexpected happened. One of the carved lines pointed directly toward a bright cluster low in the western sky. Halvard frowned. "It remembers." Bjorn turned sharply. "What?" "The stars have changed." He rotated the stone slightly. but not enough. For the first time in 31 years, he believed the carving might truly be more than decoration. It might actually guide them. Near midnight, a soft mist began rising from the water. Not thick enough to hide the ship, only enough to blur the reflections of the stars. The crew lit no lanterns. Bjorn forbade it. The sea is bright enough. He was right. The ocean itself seemed to glow faintly beneath the moon. Not with magic. With countless tiny living creatures drifting just beneath the surface, shining blue whenever the hull disturbed the water. Eirik leaned over the rail. Each ripple left a trail of light stretching behind the ship. "It looks beautiful." Bjorn nodded. "It fooled us too." Before Eirik could ask what he meant, the navigator suddenly stiffened. "Captain." "What is it?" "I hear rowing." Everyone listened. Nothing. Then, very faintly, from somewhere within the mist, a slow rhythm. Wood entering water, then lifting again. Another stroke, then another. Steady. Patient. Impossible. Ragnvald's face tightened. There shouldn't be another ship here. The rowing continued. Closer now, yet no sail appeared. No lantern, no silhouette. Only the sound of unseen oars moving through the silent sea. Every man aboard instinctively reached for his weapon. Even Bjorn's hand settled upon the hilt of his sword. The rhythm stopped. Complete silence returned. For several long heartbeats, no one dared breathe. Then, from somewhere just beyond the veil of mist, a voice called quietly across the water. Not in anger, not in warning, simply speaking one name. "Eirik." Every man on the longship turned toward him, because none of them, not even Bjorn, had spoken his name aloud. No one moved. The name drifted across the sleeping sea so softly that it might have been mistaken for the wind, had there been any wind at all. Eirik. It came again. Calm. Neither young nor old. Neither male nor female. Merely a voice carried across water that no longer behaved like any sea the crew had ever known. Leif swallowed. "You heard it too." Every man aboard nodded. Bjorn stepped in front of his son. No one answers. The order was immediate, absolute. Eirik kept his eyes fixed on the mist. "I wasn't going to." "Good." Bjorn drew his sword, though he held it low. Not threatening. "Ready." The unseen oars began moving once more. One stroke, then another. The sound circled the longship instead of approaching it directly. The crew turned slowly, trying to follow it through the mist. Nothing appeared. Not even the outline of a hull. Only faint rings disturbed the glowing water before fading back into perfect stillness. Olaf whispered, "A boat leaves waves." "It does," Bjorn replied. "So where are they?" No one answered. Halvard knelt beside the mast and carefully unfolded the pale stone map. He placed Eirik's stone beside his own small bundle of notes. "The stars," he murmured. "They're leading us somewhere." Ragnvald crouched beside him. "Can you read it?" "Not yet." He rotated the stone until one carved line aligned with the bright cluster of western stars. Another line suddenly pointed toward the moon. A third toward the horizon itself. "It isn't one map," Halvard whispered. "It's several." Bjorn looked down. "What do you mean?" "It changes." "With the sky." The realization settled over the older men. Captain Arna had never carried an ordinary chart. He had carried a guide that could only be understood beneath certain stars. A sudden splash broke the silence. Every head turned. One of the spare buckets tied beside the rail had fallen into the sea. "No," Leif said quietly. "I tied that myself." The bucket drifted only a few arms' lengths away. Then, without any current visible, It slowly began moving west, not floating, traveling, as though something beneath the surface had taken hold of it. Bjorn watched without speaking. There, he pointed toward the water. That's the current. Eirik frowned. I can't see one. You aren't meant to. The bucket continued gliding across the glass-like sea before finally disappearing into the mist. No ripple marked its passing. The crew remained awake for the rest of the night. No one trusted sleep. They took turns listening, watching, waiting. Sometimes the strange rowing returned. Sometimes it vanished completely. Once, someone thought they saw another mast standing within the mist. When they looked again, it was gone. Just before dawn, the eastern horizon began to brighten. The first hint of daylight washed the stars from the sky one by one. Halvard looked down at the pale stone. The carved lines no longer aligned. It's gone. The map. The sky it needed. He carefully wrapped the stone again. We'll have to wait until night. As the sun rose, the mist finally began to thin. The crew breathed easier. Shapes slowly emerged around them. Open water, a scattering of seabirds, nothing more. Leif laughed nervously. I knew there was nothing out there. No sooner had the words left his mouth than Steen's replacement lookout, standing at the bow, raised his hand. Ship ahead. Everyone hurried forward. At first, Eirik saw only a dark shape resting upon the calm sea. Then the mist drifted aside. It was a longship, far older than any vessel afloat in their own age. Its mast was broken. Its sail hung in rotting strips. Barnacles covered the hull far above the waterline, as though it had once floated in a very different sea. No crew stood aboard. No movement came from its deck. The ship simply drifted in perfect silence. Bjorn's face turned pale. I know her. Ragnvald stared at him. No. Bjorn nodded slowly. His voice was barely more than a whisper. That's the Sea-Wolf. The very ship that had vanished 31 years before. No one aboard the longship spoke. The abandoned vessel drifted less than 200 paces ahead, moving without sail, without oars, without any sign of life. Morning light revealed every scar across her weathered hull. Salt had bleached the timber almost white, while strands of seaweed clung to the carved dragon head at her prow. She should not have remained afloat, yet she did. Bjorn stared at her as though looking into another lifetime. I carved that dragon. His voice was quiet. I was 18. Eirik looked from the ghostly longship to his father. You built her? I helped. My father shaped the keel. Captain Arna carved the eyes. He smiled sadly. He said a ship should always be able to see the horizon before her crew did. The smile faded almost immediately. I watched her disappear. And now, he could not finish the sentence. Jarl Hakon stepped beside him. Could she truly be the same ship? Bjorn nodded slowly. Look beneath the prow. The older men narrowed their eyes. There, barely visible beneath years of salt and barnacles, was a shallow mark carved into the timber. A wolf's paw, no larger than a man's hand. Our shipwrights carved it before launch, Bjorn said. No other vessel carried it. The truth settled over the crew like a heavy cloak. The Sea-Wolf had returned, without her crew, without explanation. Bring us alongside, Hakon ordered. Bjorn immediately shook his head. No. The Jarl looked at him. Why? Because that's exactly what we did before. Silence followed. The first time? Halvard asked. Bjorn nodded. We found another abandoned vessel. Eirik frowned. You never told me. I never wanted to. He drew a slow breath. It looked harmless. We boarded. What did you find? Bjorn's eyes remained fixed upon the drifting ship. Nothing. No bodies. No cargo. No signs of battle. Only breakfast still sitting upon the table. Leif felt a chill run through him, as though everyone had vanished. Bjorn nodded once. Then we heard rowing. Every man aboard remembered the sound they had heard during the night. No one argued after that. Instead of boarding, they circled slowly around the drifting longship. The sea remained unnaturally calm. Not even the wake from their own hull disturbed the surface for long. As they passed the stern of the Sea-Wolf, Eirik noticed something. "Father." Bjorn followed his gaze. Tied securely to the steering oar hung a small leather pouch. It looked almost new. Impossible on a ship that had vanished 3 decades earlier. Ragnvald frowned. That wasn't there. You remember? I would. The pouch swayed gently, though there was almost no wind. We take only the pouch, Hakon decided. No one boards. Bjorn hesitated, then nodded. I'll go. So will I, Eirik answered. No. Bjorn's refusal came instantly. I'm faster. I'm lighter. You stay. Before another argument could begin, Halvard stepped forward. I'll fetch it. You need a man who remembers. Bjorn looked at his old friend for several long moments. Finally, he handed him a rope. Do not let go. The crew secured Halvard around the waist. He climbed carefully into the small rowing boat carried aboard the longship and crossed the narrow stretch of water alone. No one spoke. Every eye followed him. The little boat bumped softly against the side of the Sea-Wolf. Halvard did not climb aboard. Instead, he leaned out, stretching as far as he safely could. His fingers closed around the leather pouch. For one terrible moment, the drifting longship gave a deep wooden groan. Not the ordinary creak of old timber. Something deeper, as though the entire hull had sighed. Pull him back. Bjorn shouted. The crew hauled on the rope with all their strength. The little boat shot backward across the still water. The instant it cleared the side of the Sea-Wolf, the abandoned vessel began to move. Not drifting. Turning. Very slowly, without sail, without oars, without wind. Every man aboard watched in frozen silence as the ancient longship completed a slow half-circle until her prow pointed directly west, toward the endless horizon, toward whatever had waited for her for 31 years. Then she began gliding away. Faster. Far faster than any current should have carried her. Within minutes, she disappeared into a bank of mist that had not been there moments before. No wake remained behind. Only silence. Back aboard their own ship, Halvard handed the pouch to Bjorn. Inside lay a single object, a small journal bound in dark sealskin. The leather had survived remarkably well. On the first page, written in faded ink that Bjorn recognized instantly, were 6 simple words. If you found this, turn back now. Beneath the warning stood a signature. Captain Arne. No one reached for the journal. For several long moments, Bjorn simply held it in both hands, his thumbs resting upon the worn sealskin cover. The leather felt cold despite the morning sun, and the faded letters seemed almost impossible to accept. Captain Arne's handwriting, the same careful strokes, the same steady hand. It cannot be, Leif whispered. Ragnvald slowly shook his head. It can. He always wrote like that. Bjorn opened the journal with a care usually reserved for sacred things. Several pages had swollen from damp air, but the writing remained surprisingly clear. The first entries described familiar days, fair weather, strong winds, excellent fishing, arguments over the shortest western route, crew members teasing one another after evening meals. For a brief moment, Bjorn smiled. I remember this day. His finger rested upon one page. Olaf caught a cod larger than himself. A few of the older sailors laughed softly. The sound lasted only a heartbeat. The following pages changed. The handwriting became hurried. Uneven, the ink grew darker, as though Captain Arne had pressed harder with every word. The sea no longer obeys the stars. Bjorn stopped reading aloud. The crew leaned closer. He continued. Every measurement contradicts the last. We have begun marking our course twice each day, yet every chart tells a different story. Halvard quietly closed his eyes. Exactly as I remembered. Another page. We found an empty vessel today. No sign of struggle. Warm ashes in the fire. Fresh bread upon the table. No people. Leif looked toward the west. The ship we found. Bjorn nodded. It wasn't the first. Silence settled over the deck. The longship drifted steadily through the sleeping sea. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the sea seemed to demand quiet. Around midday, the strange stillness finally broke. Not with wind. With birds. A flock of white seabirds appeared from the mist ahead, circling low over the water before sweeping eastward over the mast. "They're returning," Eirik observed. Bjorn watched them carefully. "No, they're fleeing." The distinction mattered. Every experienced sailor aboard understood why. Birds rarely abandoned feeding grounds without reason. Something had disturbed them. Late that afternoon, the mist began lifting for the first time since entering the sleeping sea. Slowly, the horizon returned. Then Olaf, standing near the bow, pointed ahead. Land. Every head turned. Far in the distance rose dark cliffs unlike any coastline they had ever seen. Not high, not dramatic, simply ancient. The rock appeared almost black beneath the afternoon light, while pale waterfalls traced silver lines down its face into the sea below. "No map mentions this," Jarl Håkon said. "It isn't the island," Bjorn replied. "How can you be sure? Because we never saw it." Ragnvald narrowed his eyes. "Then where did it come from?" No one answered. They altered course slightly, keeping a respectful distance from the unfamiliar coast. As they drew nearer, details slowly emerged. Great stone arches worn smooth by countless winters. Dense forests of twisted pine growing almost to the water's edge. Hundreds of seabirds nesting among the cliffs. There were no houses, no smoke, no docks, only untouched wilderness. "It looks empty," Leif said. Bjorn nodded, which means someone may be watching. Just before sunset, Eirik climbed to the forward lookout platform. The sea had finally begun to breathe again. Small waves rolled beneath the hull. The first real breeze in 2 days stirred the edge of the sail. He welcomed the movement. It reminded him that the world still obeyed familiar rules. Then something caught his eye. At first he mistook it for another pale cliff. He blinked, looked again. It wasn't stone. Far inland, rising above the forest canopy, stood a single tower, not built from timber, not built from rough rock. Its pale walls reflected the setting sun like polished ivory. No smoke rose from it. No banners fluttered. It stood utterly still, watching the sea. "Eirik," Bjorn called from below. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he kept staring at the distant structure. "What do you see?" Very slowly, he pointed toward the western horizon. "There." The older men followed his hand. One by one, expressions changed. Halvard's face drained of color. Ragnvald whispered something under his breath that no one else could hear. Bjorn stood frozen. After 31 years, he had found it again. the tower they had sworn never to speak of. And as the last light of the sun slipped below the horizon, a single flame suddenly appeared at its highest window. Someone had just lit a beacon. The beacon burned steadily against the gathering twilight. No smoke rose from it. No sparks drifted into the evening sky. It shone with a calm, unwavering light, neither bright enough to guide ships nor weak enough to mistake for an ordinary fire. Every man aboard the longship stared toward the distant tower. No one celebrated. No one spoke. After 31 years, the place they had sworn never to seek had found them first. Bjorn was the first to recover. Lower the sail. The crew obeyed without question. The canvas folded neatly against the yard while the ship lost speed, gliding across the darkening water. "We'll anchor here?" Jarl Håkon asked. "For the night." Bjorn nodded. "We do not approach unknown shores in darkness." The anchor splashed quietly into the sea. The longship settled with a gentle pull upon the rope. For the first time since leaving home, true stillness returned. Only this time, it felt different. They had not stopped because of fear. They had stopped because they had arrived. As darkness spread across the coast, the mysterious tower remained visible. The beacon continued burning. Watching, waiting. Eirik stood beside the railing, unable to look away. It almost feels alive. Halvard joined him. When we first saw it, he smiled faintly. Captain Arne said exactly the same thing. What happened? We argued. About what? Whether to land. And my father? Halvard glanced toward Bjorn. He wanted to wait until morning. What did Captain Arne decide? The old traveler looked back toward the distant light. He chose curiosity. His voice carried a quiet sorrow. It cost us everything. That evening, no songs were sung. Instead, the crew shared a simple meal of dried fish, oat bread, and warm broth prepared over a small iron pot. Even Leif, who usually filled silence with stories, seemed content simply to listen to the quiet sounds around them. The distant surf breaking against unseen rocks. The creak of the mast. The occasional cry of seabirds settling for the night. It reminded Eirik of evenings at home. Yet everything felt somehow older, as though this coastline had been waiting through centuries of silence. After the meal, Bjorn finally opened Captain Arne's journal again. Several pages near the end had been damaged by damp, but enough remained to read. He turned to the final written entry. The handwriting had become uneven, almost trembling. He read aloud. "If we have reached the place I believe we have, then the greatest danger is not what waits upon the island." The crew leaned closer. "The greatest danger is believing we understand it." Bjorn turned the page. Blank. The next page. Blank. Then, near the back cover, one final sentence, written in darker ink than the rest, as though added later. "Do not enter after sunset." Silence settled over the deck. Leif looked toward the glowing tower. The beacon. Bjorn nodded. It was lit at sunset. No one needed to say what they were all thinking. Something on the island wanted visitors to arrive after dark. The watches were doubled. Eirik drew the second watch beside Bjorn. Father and son stood together near the bow beneath a sky overflowing with stars. "You've become quieter," Bjorn said. "I've been listening." A faint smile appeared beneath his beard. Good. They remained silent for a while. Then Eirik spoke. "When this is over..." Bjorn looked at him. "Do you think we'll ever fish the fjord again?" His father did not answer immediately. He looked back toward the distant coast. "I hope so." You didn't say yes. No, I didn't. It was the most honest answer he could give. Just before midnight, the sea changed once again. Not violently. Gently, the ship, which had rested quietly at anchor for hours, began turning by itself. Very slowly, the anchor rope remained tight. No wind touched the sail, yet the bow continued rotating until it pointed directly toward the island, toward the tower, toward the burning beacon. At that exact moment, the flame atop the tower went out. Darkness swallowed the distant structure. Then, from somewhere deep within the unseen forest beyond the shore, a single horn sounded. Low, ancient. Not a Viking war horn. Not any instrument known to the men aboard the ship. Its mournful note rolled across the water and echoed among the cliffs. Bjorn's face turned pale. He had heard that sound once before, 31 years earlier, on the night that 19 men had vanished without a trace. The mournful note lingered over the water long after the horn itself had fallen silent. No echo should have carried so far. The cliffs were too distant, the wind too weak. Yet the sound seemed to circle the anchored longship before slowly fading into the night. Every man aboard remained perfectly still. Bjorn's hand rested upon the hilt of his sword. Not because he expected an attack, because memory had moved faster than reason. It was the same horn, Halvard whispered. Bjorn nodded. I never forgot it. No one slept. The beacon remained dark. The forest beyond the shore became nothing more than a black wall stretching beneath the stars. Even the seabirds had fallen silent. Leif leaned close to Eirik. I thought adventures would be louder. Eirik managed a faint smile. So did I. This place. Leif glanced toward the unseen island. Doesn't feel empty. No. It feels as though we're the ones who don't belong. Neither of them laughed. Just before dawn, a pale mist drifted away from the shoreline. The first rays of sunlight reached the island. What had been hidden during the night slowly emerged. Ancient stone terraces climbed the hillside above a narrow natural harbor. Broad stairways disappeared beneath vines and moss. Massive walls, broken by time, stretched between weathered towers whose upper floors had long since collapsed. Trees had grown through courtyards and rooftops alike, their roots splitting carefully cut blocks that no ordinary village could ever have shaped. No smoke, no movement, no voices, only ruins. Jarl Håkon stared in silence. This wasn't a fortress. No, Bjorn replied. It was a city. Captain Arna's warning echoed through everyone's thoughts. Do not enter after sunset. Morning had come. Bjorn finally nodded. We land. The crew lowered the small rowing boats into the water. No one remained behind except 2 sailors ordered to guard the longship. Eirik stepped into the first boat beside Bjorn, Halvard, Ragnvald, and Jarl Håkon. The oars dipped quietly into the sea. No one spoke during the crossing. The island grew larger with every stroke. Soon the smell of pine replaced the smell of open water. Fresh water spilled from the cliffs into the bay in thin silver streams. Wildflowers grew between ancient stone blocks at the edge of the shore. It looked peaceful, almost welcoming, too welcoming. The boats scraped gently against a narrow beach of pale stones. Bjorn stepped ashore first. He knelt briefly, touching the ground with his fingertips. The same place. He stood. The harbor hasn't changed. Halvard looked around slowly. The trees have. Ragnvald pointed toward the great stairway leading inland. It begins there. Without another word, the party climbed. Each step had been carved from enormous blocks of pale stone. Despite centuries of rain and frost, they remained astonishingly even. Someone had built this place to last. As they reached the top, the forest opened into a vast square. Eirik stopped. Before him stood dozens of broken columns surrounding what had once been a magnificent hall. Fragments of statues lay scattered across the ground. Mosaic floors still showed traces of deep blue and gold beneath blankets of moss. Water flowed gently through narrow stone channels that somehow remained unblocked after countless years. "This is impossible," Leif whispered. "No Viking built this." "No," Bjorn answered. "They were already gone when we arrived." At the center of the square stood a circular platform. Its surface was carved with the same symbol carried on the pale stones. 7 stars surrounding a single circle. Eirik instinctively reached beneath his cloak. The stone felt strangely warm. Before he could remove it, a deep voice echoed across the ruined city. "You finally came back. Every sword left its sheath." The men turned as one. Standing beneath the broken archway of the ancient hall was an old man dressed in a simple gray robe. His hair was white. His beard reached almost to his waist. He carried no weapon, only a wooden staff polished smooth by many years of use. His eyes rested not upon Bjorn, not upon Ragnvald, but upon Eirik. The old man smiled gently. "I've been waiting for the 5th bearer." And for the first time since setting foot on the island, Bjorn understood the terrible truth. Captain Arne had never failed to discover the city's greatest secret. He had succeeded. He had simply spent the rest of his life trying to make certain no one else ever found it. No one lowered their weapon. The old man remained exactly where he stood beneath the broken arch, his wooden staff resting lightly against the ancient stone. Around him, vines climbed shattered columns, while shafts of morning sunlight filtered through the collapsed roof, illuminating drifting dust that danced lazily in the still air. "I have waited many years," he said. His voice carried no threat, only patience. Bjorn stepped forward. "We buried this place." "You buried your memory of it," the old man replied gently. "But stone remembers." Silence followed. Then the old man turned his eyes toward Eirik once more. "You carry what your father could not." Eirik slowly removed the pale stone from beneath his cloak. For the first time since receiving it, he held it openly. Morning light touched its carved surface. The 7 stars engraved upon it began reflecting the sunlight in different directions. Each beam finding one of the matching carvings set into the circular platform beneath their feet. A low rumble echoed through the ruins. No walls moved. No hidden doors opened. Instead, water began flowing once more through the ancient channels surrounding the square, filling them with crystal-clear streams that glittered beneath the sun. The city was not awakening. It was remembering. The old man smiled. "Our ancestors built no weapon, no empire. They built knowledge." He pointed toward the ruined halls surrounding them. These stones preserved the paths of the stars, the tides, the changing currents, the sea itself. Bjorn closed his eyes. So the legends were true. They became legends because men feared what they did not understand. The old man looked toward the horizon beyond the island. "Those who come behind you do not seek wisdom. They seek power." As if answering his words, the sound of distant horns rolled across the bay. Everyone turned. Beyond the harbor, the Crimson Fleet had finally arrived. 8 ships entered the sheltered waters in disciplined formation. There would be no avoiding them now. Jarl Hakon drew his sword. We stand here. Ragnvald nodded. So they cannot carry this place back into the world. The old man slowly shook his head. No. Every eye turned toward him. If blood is spilled upon this platform, he rested his hand upon the ancient stone. Everything these people protected will be lost forever. Eirik looked around the ruined city, the flowing water, the weathered carvings, the quiet dignity that had survived centuries without demanding anything from the world. He finally understood. This place had never hidden treasure. Its greatest treasure was restraint, knowledge preserved by those wise enough not to use it for conquest. The first enemy boats reached the shore. Armed men rushed onto the beach below. Yet before they could climb the ancient steps, something extraordinary happened. A thick sea mist rolled silently into the harbor. Not from the land, from the water. Within moments, every crimson ship disappeared behind a wall of white. Shouts echoed across the bay. Oars struck hidden rocks. Commands became confused. The fleet could no longer see the island that lay only a few hundred paces away. Bjorn stared in amazement. The current. The old man smiled. The sea has always protected those who respected it. No magic, no miracle, only the forgotten knowledge of winds, tides, reefs, and hidden channels that ancient generations had mastered long before others learned to cross the northern seas. Eirik stepped onto the center of the circular platform. He looked toward his father. You spent your whole life protecting this place. Bjorn nodded. I tried. You don't have to protect it alone anymore. The older man smiled through eyes filled with tears. No, I don't. For the first time since leaving the village, father and son stood not as teacher and student, but as equals. Several hours later, the longship quietly departed the island. The Crimson Fleet, trapped in shifting fog and treacherous currents, searched in vain for a harbor that seemed to vanish whenever they approached. Before leaving, Eirik turned one last time. The old man still stood beneath the broken archway. He raised his staff in farewell. Then the mist closed once more around the forgotten city until it disappeared completely from sight. No map would ever mark its position again. Weeks later, the familiar cliffs of home rose from the morning sea. The village welcomed them with the tears, laughter, and long embraces. Many stories were told that winter. Some spoke of storms, others of distant islands. None spoke of the forgotten city. That secret remained with the few who had earned it. Years passed. Bjorn returned to fishing. Life eventually married the woman he had once feared meeting, and spent the rest of his life joking that the voyage had been easier than the wedding. Jarl Hakon grew old, knowing his people had protected something greater than themselves. And Eirik, he never became famous because of a battle, nor because he conquered unknown lands. Instead, sailors sought him out because no one understood the sea as deeply as he did. When young fishermen asked how he always seemed to find the safest passage through storms, he simply smiled. The sea is never your enemy, he would say. It only asks whether you are willing to listen. On quiet evenings, he would sit upon the same weathered cliff where he had watched the horizon as a boy. The waves still whispered against the rocks. The gulls still circled above the fjord. Nothing seemed different. Yet everything had changed. For the ordinary fisherman who had once dreamed of the world beyond the horizon had returned home not as a conqueror, but as the keeper of a forgotten promise. And somewhere far beyond the western sea, hidden once again by mist, stars, and memory, the ancient beacon remained dark, waiting for an age when curiosity and wisdom would once more travel together.